Off. Welcome, everybody. I am Mark Alexander. I'm the Arthur J. Kenya Dean here at the Villanova University Charles Widger School of Law. And it is really my pleasure, my honor to welcome you to the 15th Annual John F. Scarpa Conference on Law, Politics, and Culture, in which we'll be discussing and taking measure of the Biden effect. And that is, I think, a really fascinating topic we're going to be looking at. It is, and it follows in the great tradition of these conferences, 15 years now, and following under the wonderful leadership of Professor Patrick Brennan, who will take over in just a moment. But I'm just so glad that we can have these conversations today. I'm so grateful for the support of John Scarpa that he's provided for this programming and throughout the law school. He has been a great friend and supporter of the law school, and certainly me personally as dean. And this gives us an opportunity today and in each year we get to think about the intersection of who we are, in that we are a law school in a Catholic university. And we get to explore important questions of law, politics, culture, faith, and today is no different. And I expect this can be a fantastic event. When Professor Brennan first mentioned this idea to me, it was just so exciting for us to think about how we can talk about what is happening currently today, and how we can think about historically the impact of faith in our politics, in our law, in our culture. And particularly in the context of the second elected Catholic president. So I think that today will be an opportunity for us to explore our roots as a community bound by law, a community bound by faith, a community bound by the Constitution of the United States. It is really an extraordinary opportunity. I'm very proud to see such a great group here. So I welcome all those who are presenting, and certainly all of you who are attending, and certainly look forward to when we'll be able to do this in person. I appreciate that everyone would participate via Zoom. The conference every year is very lively, and I expect it'll be no different, even though we have a different format. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for being here to be part of what I'm sure will be a wonderful conversation. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Professor Patrick Brennan.
Good morning. My name is Patrick Brennan, and I'd like to begin by thanking Dean Alexander first for making this introduction and for all his support in recent years, including especially this year of the John F. Scarpa Conference on Law, Politics, and Culture. I would like to proceed to thank John Scarpa himself. I know John is with us this morning. He's been a faithful attendee of the conference named for him. And I'd like to thank him not only in general for his great generosity to Villanova, but for the vision he had all those years ago that attracted me to Villanova in the first place, of endowing a chair in Catholic legal studies so that we could make the most of the mission of this Augustinian Catholic university to do something distinctive, useful to the church and to the culture and to our legal order. Before I begin my remarks, I am required for those seeking CLE credit to announce the first of 3 CLE words for the day. And I didn't choose it. I'm just reporting the news. And the first word is champ. Champ. And I will announce the second and third words later in the day. And later in the day, Victoria Durand will come on and explain some mechanics for those seeking the CLE credits. With that out of the way, I'd like again to welcome everyone to the 15th Annual John F. Scarpa Conference, the first one via Zoom. And the past Scarpa conferences were by design and good fortune and providence occasions of great in-person fellowship, and I miss that, but we'll make the most of it today and hope that next year we'll be back together in person. So thank you, everyone, for joining. The annual John F. Scarpa Conference on Law, Politics, and Culture is usually held earlier in the academic year, but this time the necessities of scheduling assured, providentially, that the conference would occur now, deep in the liturgical season of Easter, when the church, through its liturgy and its readings, is teaching her members, laity, clergy, and hierarchy alike what it means to be church. My hope for the conversation today is that it will be an exploration of possibilities in a search for truth about what the church is amid all that President Biden inevitably, but also by some of his very specific choices, is showing the world what the church means now to the most famous Catholic layman in the world. It is not what it meant to Thomas More, to be sure, but the questions I would like to ask center around what it is that the church today should ask of Mr. Biden and what the church today offers Mr. Biden, along with the rest of us, with our hopes, fears, dreams, hatreds, sins, and above all, our loves. So to begin this exploration of possibilities in a search for truth, Villanova, as an Augustinian university, gives us a privileged opportunity to understand ourselves and indeed God through the mind and heart of St. Augustine. In my Justice and Rights class just last week, we read in chapter 24 of book 19 of the City of God that, quote, if we are to discover the character of any people, we have only to examine what it loves. In the Liturgy of the Hours for earlier this week, the third week of Easter, the church gave us a sermon from St. Augustine on Psalm 149. And in that sermon, Augustine takes up the theme of our loves. Quote, there is not one who does not love something, but the question is what to love. The Psalms, Augustine continues, do not tell us not to love, but to choose the object of our loves. Everyone loves, but the objects of our loves are not created equal. We are then, as Augustine continues, to order our loves, and so orient ourselves to what is truly, not merely, apparently good. I will return to the objects of our loves, their right ordering, and how we come to know them. But my present point concerns our ability to change those objects, our ability, that is, to choose, and in turn, to change our loves. Are our loves fixed and immovable? Or can you or I, this morning or later this afternoon, shift or begin to shift from disordered loves to better ordered loves? Well, as you know, there exists a long and not completely conclusive debate among Christian and even specifically Catholic theologians about what we can expect from ourselves and our fellow human beings in terms of reforming our loves. Luther, for his part, was not optimistic. What is less obvious but worthy of our attention today is that this internecine debate about our freedom to choose to reorder our loves has a parallel track with its own set of parallel resolutions in contemporary political theory, just as it did in the political theory out of which it grew. Eric Nelson's recent book, The Theology of Liberalism, Political Philosophy and the Justice of God, Harvard University Press, 2019, to pick just one very recent example, shows how Rawlsianism represents just one, and I would say remarkably unsuccessful, effort to resolve what Nelson himself calls the Pelagian issues in political terms. The more general and in turn more common way our political theory resolves this set of questions, though, is on the basis of what I will call a reductionism. A reductionism specifically, as theologian Frederick G. Lawrence explains, quote, not only of the supernatural to the natural, but also of the natural to sin, close quote. The tendency of this reductive line of thought, of the supernatural to the natural and the natural to sin, is at work, Lawrence observes, in the now business as usual expectation of or demand for, quote, respect for any decisions a person happens to make, or for any moral contents or lifestyle to which people happen to commit themselves, close quote from Lawrence. Frequently, this justificatory narrative is known as expressive individualism. And the aspect of expressive individualism that I am underscoring here is its tendency to reduce the supernatural to the natural and the natural to sin, almost as a kind of necessity. In our nation today, reductionism finds coercive effect in such precedents as Lawrence against Texas, Planned Parenthood against Casey, and Obergefell against Hodges, among a growing number of others. Someone committed to the reductionist line of thinking will sometimes be heard to ask, when confronted with evidence of questionable human behavior, who am I to judge? We've all heard the question, and it is, indeed, a question well worth asking, precisely in order to clarify an all-important distinction, a distinction that must never, ever be transgressed. It is this, that I myself am the only person on the planet I can accuse of being a sinner. Never may I accuse my brother or my sister of sin. As Remy Bragg writes, quote, I alone can accuse myself of sin. I can observe that someone else commits a misdeed, but I do not have the right to accuse anyone else of sin. This, in fact, would itself be a sin. Of myself alone can I say that I am fully responsible for what I did. But if I cannot accuse my fellow man of sin, I can indeed accuse him of a misdeed. So too can the civil authority, and with the due process of a criminal trial, convict and punish him or her for the culpable misdeed. Likewise, so too can the church accuse her members, the baptized as well as those in holy orders, of crimes, and also, with due process, convict and punish them for those crimes, as happened in recent history when the person formerly known as Theodore Cardinal Mccarrick was, after a canonical administrative proceeding that found him guilty of canonical crimes, reduced to the lay state and renamed Mr. Mccarrick. Some people, including pastors, have asked in print why Pope Francis, when he confirmed this sentence on Mccarrick and ordered it res judicata, did not also, for the good of Mccarrick's soul, in the hope of inducing his repentance, impose some medicinal penalty, such as a life of penance in a monastery, or even excommunicate him, and thus invite him, through his induced repentance, to rejoin the communion of the church. Those pursuing this line of analysis have suggested an insufficiency of mercy, of true mercy, in the bureaucratic remedy that ended Mccarrick's case without any clear and concerted concern for Mccarrick's soul. Mccarrick's case is of more than passing interest for the questions around which we have gathered today, an exploration of possibilities in search for truth. On November 10, 2020, the Vatican Secretariat of State issued the Mccarrick Report, 461 pages of narrative on the life of Theodore Edward Mccarrick from 1930 to 2017. The story it tells is one of disordered desires and corresponding misdeeds on the part of Mccarrick, of course, but also what is harder to understand and even accept, of an institutional pattern of behavior on the part of some members of the hierarchy in conspiracies of ignoring, denying, facilitating, and rewarding Mccarrick, even as he was known or believed to be acting on disordered desires in a serially predatory way with respect to young men who were presenting themselves for the ministerial priesthood. While there may be some suggestion that Pope Benedict attempted to impose sanctions on Mccarrick, any such effort by the Pope Emeritus or other members of the hierarchy during the period Mccarrick was a bishop and then a cardinal were, at best, half-hearted, weak, and ineffectual. The good of Mccarrick's soul, like that of his victims, and at the same stroke, the common good of the church, were ignored or negligently, recklessly, or intentionally damaged. The church's canon law, in place for more than a millennium for cases like this, because the church has never been pure in her human element, was ignored and not used with respect to Mccarrick over decades. What Mccarrick's case shows writ large, thanks to the mind-boggling detail we have from those 461 pages of the report, is what happens when the church fails to be church by preferring instead to be, as a practical matter, a bureaucracy in the most pejorative sense of that term, captured from within and from without, and too often, though not always, just muddling through. While preserving the formal notions of deeds and misdeeds, sin and grace, what we read about in the report is a church that in all too human ways had adopted as a practical matter, not formally or uniformly, but informally and widely, that reductionist mentality according to which the supernatural is reduced to the natural and the natural to sin, where sin is minimized and never, in Mccarrick's case at least, treated with the healing balm of medicinal punishment in hope of spiritual regeneration. To be clear, and to anticipate a worthy objection, the church is indeed, and in some sense must be, an institution, but the ordering institutional elements are rightly ordered to the church's being community, spouse, and mother, indeed, the mystical body of Christ. For priests especially, the church is a spouse. And in the Mccarrick report, we read about a disordered relationship between a priest, bishop, cardinal, and his spouse, the church. What all of that amounts to is a series of failures on the part of the hierarchy to do their part rightly to order the members of the body of Christ and their loves, delivering instead a case that will define this era of American Catholic history, second only to the possible defining capacity of the presidency of the second president, who is a Catholic. When eventually Mccarrick was convicted and his conviction judged res judicata by Pope Francis, it was according to the process, though a truncated administrative process, provided by the Code of Canon Law and its implementing regulations. But as I've already suggested, the church's failure with respect to Mccarrick involves and is the result of, in important part, the church's decades-long failure to follow canon law and the procedures for juridically addressing, for the salvation of souls, as well as the prevention of harms, alleged crimes and sins. The lawlessness, I mean to say, was on both sides. The hierarchy's systemic failures to follow the church's own juridical norms and procedures in Mccarrick's case are part and parcel of the church's general reluctance in recent decades to take ownership of her reality as a complete society, societas perfecta, with coercive jurisdiction over her ministers and the lay faithful. Again, to anticipate a worthy objection, any Catholic embarrassed to continue to affirm the church as possessed of what I've called coercive jurisdictional power would do well to study the work of Charles Journet, created a cardinal by St. Pope Paul VI, and specifically Volume 1 of Journet's study, The Church of the Word Incarnate, which has assisted me in understanding the jurisdictional power of the church as, precisely, God's own gift to the church to assure her sufficiency to her divine purpose. I quote Cardinal Journet, "If the divine influx which generates and sustains the church passes through the visible hierarchy, if it avails itself of the sacramental and jurisdictional powers, it is not in order to organize angels, but to bring men together into a visible supernatural society, to incorporate them wholly into the organism of supernatural salvation." Close quote from Journet. Mccarrick, like the rest of us, was not, is not an angel. Mccarrick, though, unlike most of the rest of humanity, was a serial predator who used his status as a member of the hierarchy to prey on young men. And Mccarrick, while acting as priest, bishop, and cardinal, was in important respects abandoned by his own church that knew, the record shows, that his disordered loves were infecting even his exercise of his priestly and episcopal ministries. What Mccarrick needed was callously denied, and that is to be incorporated wholly into the organism of supernatural salvation, ironic as that is to say of a former cardinal of the Catholic Church. What I've suggested is that the Church's abandonment of Mccarrick over all those years, and the concomitant abandonment of the faithful who were the immediate victims of his crimes, but also of the countless faithful whose trust in the Church has been shattered, reflects in practice, if not at the level of theology, a reduction of the supernatural to the natural and of the natural to sin. Why? Because where in that history, including in that final administrative res judicata, was there evident a conviction that the supernatural is at hand to correct and transform the natural? Why the systemic indifference to the power of the supernatural to offer sinners a remedy not also offered, say, by the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946? St. Augustine, in the Sermon on Psalm 141, from which I quoted above, having instructed us to choose our loves, continues, "But how can we choose unless we are first chosen? We cannot love unless someone has loved us first." Listen, Augustine continues, to the Apostle John. We love him because he first loved us. The source of man's love for God, Augustine continues, can only be found in the fact that God loved him first. He has given himself as the object of our love, and he has also given us its source. What this source is, Augustine continues, we may learn more clearly from the Apostle Paul, who tells us, "The love of God has been poured into our hearts." This love, Augustine concludes, is not something we generate ourselves. It comes to us through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Close quote. Father Bernard Lonergan, who among more or less contemporary theological influences has had the greatest influence on my own thinking, never tired of repeating St. Paul's statement at Romans 5:5 about God's love having been poured into the hearts, our hearts, through the Holy Spirit that has been given us, including, as Lonergan went on to specify, in the individual forms of the supernatural virtue of charity or love. This is something of which the Administrative Procedure Act knows nothing, but it is of the essence of the Catholic faith, and faith in God's redemption of the human race through Jesus Christ in the Holy Spirit deprives us any warranted opportunity to bless reductionism. It does not, however, as Frederick Lawrence taught me, free us from the need to attend to and address consequences of, quote, the imperfection of human embodiments of the absolutely supernatural solution to human evil, close quote from Lawrence. Attentive to the imperfections of those human embodiments, we must proceed to affirm that the solution to evil is the supernatural, and the Church, when not succumbing in her human element to temptation to reduce the natural to sin, will be precisely the supernatural in operation. And this would be the working of grace, about one possible operation of which Journet also writes in his book, The Meaning of Grace, and I quote, "Do we realize that sometimes a single truly Christian action is enough to shake a soul to its depths?" Close quote. Was it one truly Christian act that Mccarrick never received? Joseph R. Biden, the second Catholic president of the United States, 50 years after the first, quoted St. Augustine at his inauguration. Unlike the first Catholic president, who was careful to steer far clear of overt references to his Catholicism, Mr. Biden delivered an inaugural speech that, in the words of David Gibson, writing for the Berkeley Forum, quote, sounded like the sacramental reconsecration of a defiled sanctuary. That vibe, Gibson continues, was of a piece with his entire campaign, one centered on a battle, as he often said, for the soul of the nation. Gibson continues, quote, Biden's overtly religious framing of our national crisis has been matched by the explicitly Catholic expression of his own faith. Biden goes to Mass every weekend, receives ashes at Lent, wears his late son's rosary on his wrist, and unabashedly and sincerely, if maddeningly to his foes, invokes his faith at every turn, close quote. Gibson's report, which I just quoted, can take us only so far. Next, I will let Mr. Biden speak for himself, here in his 2007 memoir. Quote, I'm as much a cultural Catholic as I am a theological Catholic. My idea of self, of family, of the wider world comes from my religion. It's not so much the Bible, the Beatitudes, the Ten Commandments, the sacraments, or the prayers I learned. It's the culture, close quote. Interpreting Mr. Biden's words with the hermeneutic of charity that's called for, a first response would be that Mr. Biden is not competent, as none of us is, to rule out the possible effects that the sacraments, which we see Mr. Biden receive publicly, have had in our lives, and so in our loves, nor of grace working through channels other than the sacraments, nor of, as Biden says, the Bible, the Beatitudes, the Ten Commandments. Who indeed is Mr. Biden to judge that the sacraments have not already done for him what he could not have done for himself? It is an objective question, nonetheless, susceptible of a natural answer, as it was with Mccarrick, and as it is for every one of us, whether his conduct is consistent with the Bible, the Beatitudes, and the Ten Commandments. And it is for the Church, which preceded Scripture, not the other way around, to judge that conduct as deed or misdeed, and, in the proper forum, a sin. As Archbishop Charles Chaput recently wrote in his book, Things Worth Dying For, and I quote, "We need the Church in order to be faithful to the Word of God, which wasn't passed on to individuals, but rather given to the believing community. To interpret Christian life as primarily a relationship between myself and the Scriptures ignores where Scripture came from. It also makes me an independent little pope," Chaput writes, and that kind of autonomy is the primary sin of Adam and Eve. Salvation is a personal matter, but it's found and lived in community, close quote. President Biden is acutely aware that policies he has long advocated and worked for, policies that he will now implement or seek to implement through the power vested in him under Article 2 of the Constitution, such as codifying Roe against Wade, are substantively inconsistent with the moral law as taught by the Church. Mr. Biden is also aware that the Church judges his doing so to be formal cooperation in grave moral evil, and that, for that reason, he is not, in the judgment of the Church, fit to present himself to receive Holy Communion. President Biden's familiar responses start with the one that he is personally opposed to the policies on behalf of which he has long labored and on the basis of which he has campaigned, and for and on the basis of which he now acts as president. When asked then about whether he should receive Holy Communion, or whether some bishops aren't correct that under canon law, and specifically canon 915, he is not to be admitted to Holy Communion, President Biden's response to reporters has been that, quote, "Pope Francis, when I'm with him, gives me communion," close quote. One deep question here, implicating Hobbesian themes, is whether the supreme lawgiver in the Church, Pope Francis, is bound, at least by the rational force of the Church's law, and specifically Canon 915. Lawlessness, as I suggested through the case of Mccarrick, has its own distinctive tragic consequences. President Biden's public mention of Pope Francis's private action in giving him Holy Communion brings me to my next point. The mainstream media for some time have contended that Pope Francis is an ally of President Biden's. Just yesterday, Pope Francis spoke by invitation at President Biden's Global Climate Summit. During Mr. Biden's campaign for the presidency and the promise to build back better, Pope Francis, on his Twitter account, @Pontifex, on December 20, 2020, posted, quote, "To help our society to build back better, inclusion of the vulnerable must also entail efforts to promote their active participation," close quote. Yes, Holy Father, they must. And yes, the Pope, in quoting candidate Biden's mantra, created the impression, whether he intended it or not, I cannot say, that he supported the candidate. I mentioned earlier that President Biden's inaugural speech included mention of St. Augustine. As I move toward my conclusion of these introductory remarks, please allow me to quote President Biden. Many centuries ago, St. Augustine, a saint of my church, wrote that a people was a multitude defined by the common objects of their love. What are the common objects we love that define us as Americans? I think I know. Opportunity, security, liberty, dignity, respect, honor, and, yes, the truth. Recent weeks and months have taught us a painful lesson. There is truth, and there are lies. Close quote. Indeed, there is truth, and there are lies. And I gratefully commend President Biden for reaffirming at the threshold of his presidency the distinction, often blurred or denied in aid of what I called reductionism, between truth and falsehood. But what is the truth of which President Biden speaks? For Christians, truth is first a person, and his name is Christ. And the lies we most have to worry about are those by which the father of lies would block the whole Christ. For my part, what I've come to see in recent years is that we humans, all of us, need to be conversationally opened up, a phrase I borrow from Fred Lawrence. By this, I do not mean that we need merely more conversations in the sense of more discussions or shufflings of ideas. What we need is to be opened up through all the ways the church, acting through the sacraments and the preaching of the word, can correct and transform us, raising the objects of our love ever higher and orienting us around the true good, our last end, goodness himself. The church failed Mccarrick and in turn his immediate victims, and all those among us whose faith was tested or even broken by that effectively unchallenged declension of the supernatural to the natural and the natural to sin. The bureaucratic slouches that assured the Mccarrick era cannot be precluded by any natural force. What is indispensable, and for Catholics non-negotiable, is the supernatural solution, and the church, through the word and the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, are its ordinary channels, which is why any apparent trivialization of the supernatural is the lie by which we have the most to lose individually and collectively. God desires all people to be saved, 1 Timothy 2:4. And as Cardinal Journet wrote, sometimes a single truly Christian action is enough to shake a soul to its depths. Today, a self-styled cultural Catholic in the White House provides a unique opportunity, especially in light of the public perception of an alliance between the president and Pope Francis, for the church's pastors to show the truth and what Pope Francis himself has so courageously taught that the church calls the faithful to form and reform the culture and the political order in light of the gospel, and, as the Second Vatican Council taught forcefully, to impress the natural moral law on the legal order. President Biden defends many laws and policies that find deep justification in Scripture and the moral law, and for this he is to be praised and thanked. He defends and works on behalf of others, however, that he himself cannot but acknowledge gravely violate the moral law and the will of God. While every president is called upon to act from within a mix of good and evil, as we all are, Mr. Biden is all but unique in the White House because he inevitably acts as a Catholic, as the carefully placed picture of Mr. Biden with his Pope on the desk in the Oval Office reminds the nation. My hope in organizing today's conversation has been that it can contribute in a small way to Catholics conversationally opening one another and others up to the cosmic insufficiency, the avoidable tragedy in reducing the supernatural to the natural and the natural to sin. Our hope is in the supernatural, but the supernatural does not begin only in the hereafter, but here in the form of charity. Love is the answer, but love, as my mentor, the late Judge John T. Noonan Jr., once wrote in the Harvard Law Review, quote, "Love is not simply an emotion, a sentiment captured by Valentines. It is," Noonan continued, quoting Dante, "the love that moves the sun and the other stars, that also," Noonan continues, "moved Dante, who declares neither creator nor creature ever was without love." When God, Noonan writes, is said to love human beings, an emotion is not being attributed to God. Love is a movement of the rational will seeking the good. The good, the true good, is what true love is all about. And by the outpouring of the Holy Spirit into our hearts, supernatural charity, where not blocked, makes true love move to realization in completeness. The decisive Catholic contribution today, as always, to political life is to give effect to the judgment that the political realm itself is not exempted from the requirement that it be an act of love. But so too, and first, must the church's exercise of her own jurisdiction over the faithful be an act of love for their true good. Love is the answer, but to its operations and their demands in a world no one has ever seen before, we ever stand to be conversationally opened up to and by the truth that is the person of Christ. And so let the conversation begin. Thank you very much for your attention. And with that, I would like to introduce our second speaker of the day, Fran Maier, who's currently senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and former special advisor to Archbishop Charles Chaput. And it was my pleasure when Fran Maier came to Philadelphia with Archbishop Chaput from the Archdiocese of Denver to meet Fran. And I have followed his work for the church ever since then. And this is as good an opportunity as I'll ever get to say that when I first met Fran and ever since, I thought, this is the laity as the Second Vatican Council told us it should be. Thank you, Fran, for agreeing to share your wisdom with us today.
Oh, thanks very much, Patrick. I appreciate the opportunity. I was here for the 2012 Scarpa lecture, which the Archbishop delivered, and it was terrific. The effort is wonderful, and I hope I can contribute something useful to our conversation today. I want to start by saying that President Joe Biden is good news. He's good news for American Catholics, and he's good news for the Church in the United States. I say that even though my wife and I voted for the other guy reluctantly in 2016 and more peacefully in 2020. This warrants some explaining, and I'll be happy to do that, but I need to get there in a roundabout way, so I hope you'll bear with me for a few minutes. I've worked in and around the church for 43 years, and it's been a great privilege. For 23 of those years, I served as senior aide and advisor to a bishop of some national standing. I staffed him in Rome for 3 synods, directed a joint international conference on technology with the Pontifical Council for Social Communications, wrote 2 quinquennial reports, chaired Denver's Jubilee 2000 events, helped with the World Meeting of Families here in Philadelphia, and gave support as needed during his years of committee leadership at the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference, the USCCB. Now, all of this and $5 will get me a cup of coffee at Starbucks, but I hope it provides some context for the remarks that follow. Over the past 6 months, I've done confidential interviews with 29 bishops about the future of the church for a project I'm pursuing through Notre Dame's Constitutional Studies program. 28 of those men were Americans. Now, these are mainstream guys, no cranks and no outliers. They come from very different backgrounds. They serve in a wide variety of pastoral conditions, both urban and rural, and they lead dioceses in every region of the country in 20 different states. None was encouraged by Joe Biden's election, not one. They had conflicting opinions about Donald Trump, but all were uneasy about Biden. And they were very critical of his vice president, Kamala Harris, especially given Biden's questionable durability for her track record as California's attorney general and later as a U.S. senator. Harris has drawn, as I'm sure many of you know, quite a lot of concern from religious liberty and pro-life groups for her views and actions. Several of the bishops I spoke with expressed concern about the Democratic Party's shift to the left, its curious interpretation of constitutional rights, and its appetite for increased government controls fed by the COVID pandemic. None of this, by the way, translated into praise for the Republican Party. That's another story. Most felt that cooperation could and would occur between the new White House and U.S. bishops on at least some issues of mutual concern. But overall, their common view of Biden's long-term impact on church-related matters was strongly negative. One senior bishop compared Biden unfavorably with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Cuomo, he said, makes no claim to being a good Catholic, and thus, in some ways, is more honest and easier to work with because he's just frank and out front about it. The problem with Biden, he said, is precisely the appearance highlighted by the media of his piety. Biden's rosary beads, his public nods to saints, and his attendance at Mass all serve to normalize the administration's policies and actions that directly attack key Catholic beliefs on abortion, sex, family, and marriage. This has the effect of marginalizing bishops as doctrinaire, out of touch, and seemingly aligned against the message of mercy preached by Pope Francis. To the degree this is a conscious strategy, it works. It works, as several of the interviewees noted, because bishops have the mandate to teach and lead, but in practice, in our current environment, they're generals without armies. Too many American Catholics simply don't listen to them, and civil authorities know it. More about that in a moment. I get asked from time to time why America's bishops as a body don't confront White House policies more forcefully. Here I'm speaking not just about the Biden White House, but the task of challenging the policies of any administration. My answer is that it's not true. The bishops, through the USCCB and its committees, do speak publicly about all sorts of issues, and they do it all the time, from racism and immigration to sexuality and religious liberty. In fact, a case might be made that the conference speaks too much about too many things, and thus dilutes the bishop's impact accordingly. But the USCCB as a corporate entity isn't finally a teaching body. It's more like a trade association. Teaching authority is reserved to each individual bishop in his local diocese. Moreover, the church always seeks a modus vivendi with public authority in every century and in every country. This get-along strategy has both practical and scriptural grounding, but it also has its weaknesses. The desire to minimize conflict with secular authority predisposes the church to make compromises and avoid confrontations in a way that's not always prudent. Additionally, the bureaucratic mass of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, with its committees, internal procedures, and need for collective buy-in from its members, creates inertia. This makes any quick, clear, and decisive action by the body of bishops very difficult to achieve. We also need to remember that the civil war inside the church over what Vatican II really meant and which issues should have priority in working for the common good is not over. Quite the opposite. During the current pontificate, with its perceived ambiguities, the frictions have taken on new heat. Some of those frictions exist both among the bishops themselves and also within their staffs. And of course, civil authority and Catholic elected officials are happy to exploit that. Jesus tells us to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar. And that gospel verse certainly guides the thought of the church. But Caesar always has three defining characteristics. First, his legitimate authority is actually quite limited. Second, he thinks it's a lot bigger than it is. And third, he's never a trustworthy friend, even when he's cordial. My former boss once described the vocation of a bishop as a cross between radical witness and museum curator. If it was ever easy work, it wasn't meant to be, and it clearly isn't now. In my own experience, some bishops are mediocre or incompetent. A few are genuinely bad guys with serious moral flaws or toxic ambition, or simply a lack of real faith. But most, and I mean the great majority, are good and decent men doing the best they can for their people and doing it pretty well in a very difficult job. There's a Monty Python skit that, for me, captures at least some of the essence of a bishop's ministry. The scene is a group of athletes warming up for an event. They all have corporate backers, but the athlete being interviewed could only get a brick factory as a sponsor. So he has to carry 40 pounds of factory bricks as he competes. And of course, the event turns out to be the long jump over the English Channel. I mention all of this because before we accuse our bishops of collaboration or cowardice in dealing with a Joe Biden or a Donald Trump, we do well to show them the same understanding we expect for ourselves. The idea that America's bishops are in the pocket of the political right or anyone else, which seems to be a favorite theme of some commentators, is simply ignorant nonsense. And frankly, the real concern we should have about any Biden effect and its impact on the church in the coming decades is us, those of us who are lay people. Surveys and their data are dangerous things because their questions and their interpretation can be framed in manipulative ways. Nonetheless, they can be useful. And what they tell us about the proximate future of Catholic life in the United States is sobering. Depending on which survey one chooses to quote, as many as 20% of American Catholics have left the church since the year 2000. 80% of Americans who describe themselves as Catholics say that President Biden should be welcomed to receive the Eucharist. This despite his words and actions on issues like abortion and same-sex unions. The Biden track record directly contradicts Mr. Biden's own Catholic faith, and it ignores Catholic teaching about reception of the Eucharist that stretches back to apostolic times. But many American Catholics really don't believe in the real presence, and many of us do believe that if heaven exists, we're all going to get there, wherever it might be, and whatever we've done. Along with other diocesan staff, I oversaw a study of practicing Philadelphia area Catholics some 5 or 6 years ago. The number of active millennial Catholics in the metro region was predictably low, and declining sacramental statistics of the last 20 or 30 years simply confirm that. Some of this Catholic bleed out can obviously be tracked to the clergy abuse crisis, which quite rightly shocked and angered a lot of people. But it's also too convenient an alibi, because the exodus started well before the crisis. I think the truth lies elsewhere. Charles Péguy once suggested that the trouble with many Catholics is that they don't really believe what they believe. Speaking the words of our creed, the Nicene Creed, every Sunday should be, at least every once in a while, a numinous experience. The words matter. They're the glue to our community of faith. They mean something that should dominate our attention. But we often speak them in a kind of somnambulistic trance. Many of us live our faith mainly as a useful code of moral behavior and a healthy system of social ethics. But that's not Christianity. And we don't really need Jesus Christ or his cross for any of it. Catholics in this country have historically been outsiders and unwelcome. And so we've worked very hard over the past century to be accepted into American culture. In a sense, that's become our real religion, and we've succeeded exceptionally well at it. So well that many of us are much more faithfully American than we are Catholic. The result is predictable. A lot of American life today is a blend of vanilla spirituality that doesn't make many demands on our time and attention, and a practical consumer atheism that does. The decline in our Catholic numbers is simply the truth forcing its way to the surface through layers of self-deception that we've accumulated as a church over half a century or more. The truth can be painful, but it's never bad. The truth makes us free. Free to change, free to remember who we are as Catholics and why we're here, and free to do better. This is why Joe Biden is good news. Not happy or comfortable news, but good news. Because in his appealing personality, his sunny smile, his reassuring words, and the duplicity of his administration's actions, he embodies so much of our American Catholic moment. It was J.D. Vance, just a couple of weeks ago, who pointed out that since his election, President Biden has spoken eloquently again and again about the need for unity and healing, and then his administration's actions have gone in exactly the opposite direction. That's called lying. In Washington, the habit of lying is thoroughly bipartisan and hardly exceptional. But Mr. Biden is our Catholic president. I've said elsewhere, and it's worth saying again, that it can be tempting sometimes to look back on our lives of faith as fruitless and the good we try to do as pointless. But that kind of defeatism is actually a subtle form of pride. And it ignores the many good things happening in the church that could easily fill the next several hours. My point is this: what we do or don't do does matter. Augustine said that being faithful in little things is a big thing, and the little things we do can sometimes have very big consequences. But none of us is important enough to derail the will of God, or rather, we're each vitally important, but not because of anything we achieve. We're important because God loves us uniquely and infinitely. When we really believe that, we become people of hope, and we radiate our hope to others. Our job isn't to succeed, but to witness. Recovering a humility about our own silent apostasies, the need for our own deeper conversion, and clarity about the difficulty of the challenges for Catholic life in our country that lie ahead. These things begin the renewal of our church and our nation, and we can thank the present White House for pushing that process along with the unintended gift of its mendacity. The irony about pressure on the church is that the tepid leave and the faithful grow a spine. God will handle the rest. That's the central lesson of the cross and of all of Christian history. God brings life from death and victory from failure and defeat. We're here in the world to share in the story of salvation and be seeds in the lives of others to carry that story forward. If we do that, we've done what we were created to do. Thanks for your listening, and I suppose we move on to some questions.
Thank you very, very much, Fran. I don't at the moment see any questions in the place they're supposed to appear. And that may be because I didn't invite them, but so as not to lose time to people typing them now, I'd like to move on to the next speaker. And if there's time at the end of her presentation, then we'll take questions for both Fran and Helen. And I should have said in my introduction this morning what's on the schedule, that the day will end with a roundtable discussion, which will be primarily an opportunity for questions from the audience to the panelists. And so at the end of each session, if we don't have a chance to get to questions or particular questions, there'll be another chance later. And so now I would like to introduce Helen Alvarez, who's professor of law at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. And I've known Helen even longer than I've known Fran. I first met her when I was a fellow at the Catholic University of America and the John Paul II Institute across the street. And Helen inspired me then by her fidelity to the church and her brilliant work as a lawyer and a teacher. And whenever I'm around Helen, I know I'm hearing the truth and I'm energized to be more on its side. And so, Helen, thank you for agreeing to be with us today. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the invitation and the great questions that it spotlights. They are very much worth more than the usual soundbitey or partisan political commentary that I think they mostly generate. I think they deserve consideration from perspectives of Catholic social teaching, the informed experience of the U.S. Church. And I'm really grateful to the law school and to Mr. Scarpa and to Patrick for providing this. So while we have to first recognize here something very important, that we are not considering the question raised by our last Catholic president, John Kennedy. That is, which authority did he recognize as superior, the Constitution or his faith? Instead, we're dealing today with a situation that's better described this way. A Catholic president about whom no one has asked or would ask the question, would you put your faith above your Article 2 duties? No one seriously believes this choice to be in play. Instead, a President Biden provokes the question, what will be the impact of a Catholic president who gives no evidence of seeing any relationship between his faith and his work, unless it happens that a political stance that he or his party already supports appears to harmonize with Catholic social teaching? Then the harmony is noted. At the same time, what's the impact of a Catholic president who doesn't merely passively acquiesce to laws and policies supporting abortion, same-sex unions, transgender surgeries, et cetera, but takes an active role in exacerbating these harms for vulnerable people and actively coerces his own religious institutions and individuals, among others, to bow to state demands on these matters, when these not only violate their conscience, but trample their institutional witness? Thus, his statement that even if Roe and Casey were overturned, he would sign a federal law forcing every state to allow abortion on demand. His administration's very recent decision to fund experiments involving aborted human body parts. His support for legislation specifically denying religious exemptions in connection with a broad array of laws and policies forcing religious cooperation with abortion, same-sex unions, transgender procedures, and so forth. And his Department of Justice's pursuing litigation just this week against the Religious Sisters of Mercy in order to force them to perform transgender surgeries at their hospitals. As a professor of family law and law and religion, these are the harms that really grab my attention, and they structure my remarks today, even as I should note that I am really pleased as a citizen and as a Catholic to see the president's actions on matters ranging from welcoming more refugees and immigrants to climate action. But the president doesn't suggest that these actions are a function of his faith, but rather of his politics, although they harmonize with Catholic social teaching. So I don't think they can be the basis of an analysis about the effect of his faith on his policies. But given my expertise in the fact that the president does identify very publicly, very often as Catholic, and then sharply diverges from his faith on family matters, and thereby exacerbate really harmful divisions in Catholic faith and life, I'm going to focus on the family and religious freedom matters. The president's desire to reap applause for loving what is today really popular in Catholic social teaching, popular with his party, wealthy donors, corporations, the media, the academy. But his simultaneous move to reap applause for actively attacking what's unpopular today in Catholic teaching calls to mind a fabulous observation made by Walker Percy. Many of you know him as a Catholic novelist. He was also a doctor. He made it in a 1981 New York Times essay. Speaking about the imminent defeat of the effort to put a human life amendment in the Constitution, which, by the way, Biden once supported, Percy addresses supporters of legal abortion saying, quote, "According to the opinion polls, it looks as if you may get your way, but you are not going to have it both ways. You are going to be told what you are doing," unquote. So in this presentation, what I would like to do is to talk about what President Biden is doing when he seeks credit for embracing all the good stuff of our common faith, while denouncing all the bad stuff, bad that is, according to the metrics used by the powers that be today. So I'm concluding that he's doing two things. First, recklessly fomenting a lot of harm to a lot of really vulnerable people. And second, because of the interaction between his stances and the current situation of the US Church, and the interaction with the contents of some important questions dominating the church-state dialogue today, he's obscuring the complete and really radical implications of Jesus's great commandment to love God with all our mind and heart and soul, and our neighbor as ourselves. Let me address these in order. First, regarding the president's fomenting harm to vulnerable people, here it's a very simple matter to tell him what he's doing. These are facts easily found across scholarly and popular accounts. On the matter of abortion, he is abandoning women who undergo abortion to what the scholarly literature today concludes is, on average, a worse physical and psychological state. He's actively facilitating the practice of killing human beings in a gruesome manner and experimenting upon their dismembered parts. He is, to borrow from John Paul II's description of abortion in Evangelium Vitae, asserting that what was widely considered a trampling of human rights is rather a human right itself, and a deeply cherished one at that, the right to kill a family member at one of the most vulnerable moments of their existence. He is affirming that one may not kill a stranger, one may only kill family members, members of the school of love. In the case of his support for legally recognized marriage for same-sex couples, Biden is denying that there is anything of special importance about God or nature, whatever one believes, having created two sexes whose union brings about new human beings, society itself. There's also nothing special about procreation, and nothing special about family structures designed to allow children to know and be known, to love and be loved by the adults who brought them into this world. And by his coercive methods to force religious institutions to heal on all these matters and more, he's accelerating the eradication of communities who are trying, not always succeeding, but trying and getting up when they fail, dusting themselves off and trying again to be a foretaste of the kingdom of God in the midst of a really troubled world. Communities whose radical love for humanity is manifested without regard to passing political categories. Communities attending instead to Christian categories, as illustrated by the Good Samaritan story. Thus, they beautifully lavish their love on the immigrant, the refugee, the poor, the incarcerated, as well as the pregnant, the unborn, and the sexually dysphoric. The disappearance of these communities where human beings' interpersonal, loving relationships might provide a glimpse of the reign of God will be a huge social loss. The president's attack on religious freedom is all the more discouraging because he hasn't even thrown Catholic or other religious institutions a bone. He could have reminded Americans of what many still believe, that it's good to have honorable, charitable, and conscientious dissenters in our midst, that to lose them is to lose an important voice calling America to the principles that all men and women are equal alongside their diversity, and that it's only basic justice to sacrifice mightily for the poor and vulnerable. Instead, his Department of Justice is barking at the church's heels. His party, with his blessing, and deploying every branch of government in the effort, is threatening the missions and identities of every single Catholic institution. Second, what can we say the president is doing as a consequence of the interaction between his stances and the current situation of the US Church, and his interaction with the contents of some important questions that dominate the church-state dialogue? Here I have two subpoints. One, his slicing and dicing of Catholic issues spotlights and then wrongly answers one of the most fraught questions for the US Church. It's the issue launching 1,000 lawsuits and 1 trillion social media posts. Is there a link between what are dismissively called by some the pelvic issues and all the issues involving our care for vulnerable born persons? Partisan commentators continually deny it. They suggest, in fact, that only flipping all the church's sex, marriage, and parenting teachings would align the church with Jesus' great commandment to love God and neighbor. But further affirming the tendency to artificially divide Catholic teachings about love does violence to our faith and to vulnerable people simultaneously. It ignores the fact that God did not, for no particular reason, make two sexes whose union, called making love, creates all life, and is repeatedly used in Scripture as a uniquely important illustration of how God loves us, how we are to love Him and one another. It's one of the great needs of our day to plumb the full meaning of this creation. Writing this question off is political and theological malpractice, especially when the whole world is struggling with the question. Vulnerable people are hurt most by the lack of answers, and Catholicism has resources to offer positive contributions. And what about the fact that the earliest Christians quickly adopted these teachings regarding sex, marriage, and parenting that we continue to hold today? They understood them at a crucial time in the history of the church as a direct response to the words and life of Jesus Christ. At the very least, early Christians' understanding, which developed at a crucial time for the Holy Spirit's accompaniment of the church, deserves serious consideration. And what about the fact that some of the fathers of the church and some of the most famous preachers of that era, the ones who stressed God's radical love necessitating sacrificial practice toward the poor and the immigrant, were the same men most adamant that Christ's radical love required avoiding divorce, polygamy, abortion, infanticide, and same-sex relations, completely as against the context of their Roman world? What about the fact that for most human beings, our Good Samaritan opportunities, our chance to be radically patient, generous, and sacrificial vis-a-vis another human being, our chance to affect another person at a deep level and in a life-changing manner, will most likely come to us in the form of a boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, parent, child? It is wonderful to have the opportunity to deliver direct care to a desperate migrant at the border, to a prison inmate, or a child in foster care. Some of us have these opportunities from time to time. All of us can support those doing that work at the front lines. But every single one of us will have the very direct chance in our sex, marriage, and parenting choices to assist a nearest neighbor in life-changing ways. For example, by avoiding sexual relationships that do more harm than good to an abandoned partner, by conceiving a child in a context where she can be stably united with both of her parents, to patch things up with an alienated spouse, to provide the deep well of continuous love that our son or daughter will need if they believe themselves to be experiencing same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. Deciding not to love in these ways causes a lot of human misery, misery that unfolds in hidden places away from media attention and far more among the poor. In homes, foster homes, safe houses, abortion clinics, divorce courts, juvenile courts, all over the country. Ignoring Americans' individual responsibility, as well as our local, national, and legal responsibilities on these matters, calls to mind Dostoevsky's Father Zosima and his timeless observations about the hard work of love in action versus love in dreams. Furthermore, empirical data shows that Christian norms regarding sex, marriage, and parenting are, in fact, on the ground, loving. They're associated with less depression, fewer non-marital pregnancies and parenting, a lot less poverty, and better emotional, economic, and educational outcomes for both children and adults. They could close some of the huge gaps we're seeing in the United States between the rich and the poor. In short, what are disparagingly called the pelvic issues and Catholic social teaching are inseparable. It's harmful and irrational to hold oneself to a lower standard regarding love for one's family than love for our neighbors outside the family. Radical Christian love is required in both spheres. Neither should be espoused in a manner that is disjointed from the other. Both are the logical application of the Great Commandment. My final point here. Some of what President Biden is doing is due to the relative positions of church and state in the US today. Here I hear myself echoing a few of Fran's points. The state appears to be at the height of its power. Executive and legislative power is in the hands of one party. The executive pen is very busy. The administration, that is the administrative state, federal agencies, are extremely active, issuing thousands of pages of regulations annually, touching most Americans. And over the last year especially, more and more citizens have looked anxiously and often to the state as the wealthy and expert source of science, health, and even their basic income. At the same time, institutional religion is weakening. The sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, declining affiliation across traditional religions, and a generalized loss of religious literacy. All are well-known phenomena. But Americans respect power. Biden's choices therefore suggest that the advantage lies with Catholics who ride current trends to national acclaim, not the rubes struggling to understand and to observe a radical set of Christian demands that apply both at home and abroad, some of which are wildly popular, but others which will get you fired from your job. Finally, because of Biden's schizophrenic relationship with Catholic teaching, and because the bishops are publicly disunited in their approach to his presidency, Catholics and others will remain confused about the links between Good Samaritan behavior toward the family and towards those outside the home. The set of great questions addressed to our era will probably not get answered in ways that could reach a critical mass of people. Theologian Louis Camelli, he's an author of a beautiful and compassionate text on Catholic teachings about homosexuality. He's noted that, quote, every epoch in the history of the church has faced a particular challenge in trying to understand the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. In the early centuries of the church, this challenge had to do with coming to terms with an understanding in faith of who God is for us and who is Jesus Christ. But for the last 500 years, the church has grappled with a faith understanding of the human person. And at this moment, the faith understanding of the human person continues to develop, but with a focus on human sexuality. He's right. These are some of the most pressing questions of our time. And a great deal of human misery is unfolding because we lack better answers. President Biden's bifurcated thesis about what Christian love requires, a thesis not yet effectively countered, due in part to a fractured church leadership, is at best delaying and at worst horribly obscuring the progress of these questions, progress that's needed especially by the vulnerable and the lost. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much. I see that we have about 10 minutes. I also see no questions in the question and answer function, and I don't know whether that's because no questions have been submitted or for some reason they're not reaching me. I find it unlikely that there have been no questions submitted. If someone who is assisting me administratively, Nicole or Victoria, can confirm that no questions have been submitted. All right, Victoria has confirmed that there are no questions. So I'll just remind members of the audience that the way to submit questions, which the panelists would be delighted to receive is through the question and answer function. So I think we'll wait just a moment to see if any come in. While we're waiting, maybe I could ask Fran a question. Are you there, Fran?
Yeah, right here.
Thanks. I was wondering what was the initial purpose of those interviews that you mentioned conducting, and what do you hope will be some of the other fruits of them?
Well, it's part of a project called All Things Made New, and it's about the renewal of the church and the nation. The ones that I've done, the 29 bishops that I've done, and I may end up doing more, are the first of 3 parts. The next section I move on to clergy and religious, and then the largest group at the end will be lay people, laymen and women. So those things have to be knit together, and of course a lot of research as well to talk about the actual process of first renewing our religious conviction, the life and the structures of the church in this country, but then also the political culture.
Very interesting. And Helen, I also had a question for you, which comes from the law school classroom. You and I are alike in teaching students who are farther and farther from us in age. And I was wondering what your experience in talking to your students at George Mason about the issues of this conference has been, and specifically the Catholicity of the new kind of this president, as you described it.
You know, part of what informed my opening comments that nobody's asking the question about any hierarchy between his politics and his faith is reflected in my answer, which is that nobody's mentioned it to me. And nobody discusses it. It's of no interest. In my law and religion class, I teach toward the end, I have the students read Romney's speech about how he could be Mormon and the president, Cuomo, Kennedy, Lieberman. Lieberman did a speech about his faith and the potential presidency. It's really noteworthy that nobody bothered asking whether it was Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton, et cetera. That informed my observation that nobody's really thinking that their religion really does inform. When his religion is raised by anybody that I dialogue with, it's more a question of sort of in a more partisan manner, for any of those who, are strong in the pro-life movement, et cetera. The president has the blessing of people who work on other issues that are important to the Catholic Church. And so there. It's not an intellectual question. It's not an interesting political question. It's not an Article 2 question. It's not a non-establishment of religion question. It's always a political observation.
Yeah. That was precisely my experience, though you articulated much more effectively than I'd been able. Fran, here's another opportunity for you, since no questions remarkably have come in. Maybe this is what you're talking about, Helen, through the Q&A. We were given to expect for a while from Archbishop Gomez that the USCCB would be putting out a statement on Catholic relations between the bishops and a Catholic president, and it was called different things. And then we heard that the USCCB would not be producing such a document, and I lost track of the progress or the sidelining of that. And I wonder, Fran, whether you have any additional public information about the status of that project.
I think you just demonstrated the point that I made earlier about the difficulty, and Helen would be very familiar with this, the difficulty of getting anything strong out effectively in a reasonable amount of time. The answer is no. I think the confused messaging that you're feeling coming from the U.S. bishop is pretty representative of of the mood of them. I think the people who are inclined, the bishops who are, I know this, I don't think it, I know it because I've had the conversations. The most of the bishops really are just genuinely, at a minimum, uneasy, and I've also heard people who are extremely critical of Biden. But there is a minority, and I would suspect that it's the typical people like Cardinal Cupich, who actually, I think, publicly raised issues about a public statement, and McElroy, people like that, who have to be taken into account. Their views have to be respected and honored, and that kind of slows things down. So.
Very good.
Beyond that, I don't have any, information that I could share.
More of the same, for better or worse. All right, good. We have some questions coming in, and let me just see. The first is from the first that I'll take is from a student I had encouraged to attend, and so I want to make sure to cover this question. And it's for both speakers, and it's from Sean Skedulewski. And the question is this: for both speakers, the secular culture is dominant in America. Religion, and Catholicism in particular, seems doomed in the long run if it cannot reassert its importance in people's lives. What can lay people do to help revive a love for Christ in the broader culture?
Well, Helen, you want to take that?
Sure, Fran. I thought I knew in your gentlemanliness you'd say, Helen, go ahead. A couple of things. I'm not even sure we could call ourselves a culture. My husband has an expression where he calls the United States an economy with a culture loosely attached. Mm-hmm. And I think that's even truer. And yes, we are highly secular. We're becoming far more, we're about secular values, materialism, consumerism, individualism more. Now, but then the other side of that is we still, don't despair. We still do have a lot of marvelous religious faith, abundant. I'm in a public university teaching students of every faith and no faith. And in my law and religion class, I can tell you that, from Sikh to Muslim to Mormon to evangelical, Baptist, Catholic, it's there and it's alive. There is no such thing as doomed. Here I'll channel one of my favorite authors, Luigi Giussani, who talks about the religious sense. People will always be seeking the answer to the ultimate meaning of everything. And in that sense, it is impossible to deny the continuing importance, of religion in people's lives. They're going to be seeking the answers to these questions. We as lay people have to be, that great phrase of St. Paul, ready to give an answer for the hope that is in us, ready to explain how the joy that we have because of the reign of God, what a society that is Christian could look like, and how we live that out and where we see it and what joy it brings. In addition to verbalizing this, yes, communications media is overwhelming. We have not only to live in this way, but we have to give voice to the reason for the hope that is in us. And so much of what is good and what is beautiful is not only secularly beautiful, but it is a reflection of the living presence of Christ in the world, not extinguished, not a mere memory. But we have to be ready bravely to step up and point that out and say that. Fran, over to you.
Yeah, since 1967, I've carried around a quote that's just informed me in so many of the things that I do. It's from that great Chinese theologian Mao Zedong, and he has an essay that he wrote in the 30s called "On Protracted Conflict," and he has a quote that I'll never forget. I use it all the time. Weapons are an important factor in war, but not the decisive factor. It's people, not weapons, that are decisive. And I think that can be transferred in a weird way to the kind of struggle for the soul of the world that Christianity is involved in. I mean, we tend to underestimate the power that God puts in our lives just to be witnesses to the gospel. So if you want to rebuild the culture, you rebuild the relationships that you can actually affect. And that begins by a complete examination, truthfully, of who we are and the kind of conversion that we need to go through. I'm not optimistic about our culture at all. I think we're in pretty bad shape and going to get worse for a while. But I am very hopeful and I'm channeling Archbishop Chaput in this because this has been one of his messages all along. A lot to be pessimistic about, an enormous amount to be hopeful about, and the kinds of fantastic stuff that's going on in ministries like Fellowship of Catholic University Students and other things like that. It's all over the place, but we don't see it because we're so focused on the things that are going down the drain, and that's dangerous. It's just not Christian either.
Thanks, Brandon. And Sean, I'd like to thank you for the question. You weren't asking me, but I have to say that your presence here and your contribution in class as an intelligent, engaged Catholic contributed to my not feeling doomed this semester. And so to what's just been said, I'd add from my answer earlier, at least in my judgment, what's most needful is the church is being unabashed about the need, as I put it, for the supernatural solution. As Helen and Frank both developed so beautifully, that depends upon the possibility of meeting people where they are in organic relations and repairing, and the repairing starts there. And Sean, for your part, you've shown me how those friendships in conversation about the good begin and can grow. So thank you. We need to bring this session to an end, but there's one question that's been asked by somebody I didn't know would be joining us, and he's an old friend of ours, and it's former Ambassador Doug Kmiec, and I'm delighted that he's with us. And his question, we don't have time to answer now, but I want to ask it and get it on the table so that it's on our minds as we go through the day, and we can be sure to address it, if not before, in the roundtable at the end of the day. And Ambassador Kmiec's question is this: does your assessment necessarily lead to honoring Donald Trump over President Biden? All right. Thank you for the question. We'll take a 15-minute break and try to resume promptly at 10:15. Thank you, Fran and Helen, for getting us off to an absolutely exciting start. See everybody in 15 minutes. When I began organizing this conference around the themes that were later publicly announced, I had it in mind that it would be essential to have a pastoral perspective. And I knew some priests and maybe even some bishops I could invite. But in the course of trying to find better ideas than I immediately had, I had a conversation with a current Villanova law student, Sister Bridget Mary of the Religious Sisters of Mercy. And she had the idea to introduce me in conversation with her family's friend, Father Luke Matta, of whose work I think I'd heard before. But when I got to know Father Luke a little bit and more about his work, it was clear to me that his was just the perspective that would bring the pastoral elements, challenges, and hopes into focus with the tenor that's just right for our conversation in this Catholic Augustinian University. Father Luke did extraordinary service to be with us because, as you may observe, he's in a hotel room because he's traveling to be the church's minister at a wedding this afternoon. So thank you, Father, for dashing to and from the couple with all their anxieties and hopes and delights to make your unique contribution to our conversation. With that, Father Luke.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. What an honor and what a grace to be here with everyone who's here this morning, especially in such an important moment in the history of our country and the world, really, and talking about things that are so important. So thank you for having me. It's an honor. And if nothing else, I have been praying for the fruit and for all the good that can come out of this conference. Well, when Biden was sworn in as president of the United States on January 20th, he became by far the most prominent Catholic layman in the world, layperson. And some Catholics are excited and celebrate President Biden's very public demonstrations of his Catholicism. The mainstream media has been relentless in reminding us that President Joe Biden is a devout Catholic. On the other hand, other Catholics are scandalized by President Biden's unqualified embrace of the Democratic Party's pro-abortion and pro-gay marriage agenda. And even more worrisome, the Catholic bishops in the United States, as wonderful and as good as they are, but in a scandalous display of disunity, disagreeing and contradicting each other in public or what to do about our second Catholic president, all of this is truly worrisome for all of us. And as I understand, the goal of the conference is to consider the Biden effect on American Catholic life from historical, cultural, theological, pastoral, and legal perspectives. And as Patrick just said, I would like to approach it from a spiritual perspective within the pastoral. I'm a moral philosopher by training, and there's much to say about Biden's effect from that point of view. But here, I'm first and foremost a spiritual director. And so in my brief remarks here, what I'm going to give is what I hope is a unique perspective, that of a spiritual direction. Lots there, and obviously I can't cover, but I'm really, in the end, I'm going to focus just on two things. Now, do I think that President Biden is a good Catholic? I have no idea. I will have to have a personal conversation with him to know that. Is he a devout Catholic? I don't know either. Do I think he's being insincere when he says that he's a devout Catholic? I don't know that either. I have no data or reasons to believe that he's not being truthful, like he thinks he's being truthful. And yes, he may truly believe that he's a devout Catholic, but he's certainly a very misinformed or worse, disingenuous Catholic. And what about President Biden's parents, teachers, mentors, pastors, and bishops? What to say about them? Are they responsible for President Biden's ideas and actions? Are the priests and bishops who could say or do something about Biden's decisions and policies, are they acting wrongly? And thus causing both scandal and confusion among the faithful. Well, as a spiritual director, how would I guide President Biden? And what would I say to him? And what would I say to Biden's main pastor, the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C.? And these are questions that I think are important ones that I've asked myself and that I want to bring here to the floor. Now, there is a fundamental truth of our faith and of Christian theological anthropology, and that's that love is always the rule and it's always the path. Well, I don't know President Biden. I've never had the opportunity to meet with him and spend time with him. I have strong and very profound disagreements with his views and policies regarding fundamental moral issues, especially abortion and marriage and religious freedom. However, I can't and will not pass judgment on Joseph Biden as a person. What I need to do is to love him. I have no idea what's in his heart. I don't know what his motives are. So I leave it to God to do the judging. I think that is the Christian way. And so I pray for him, and I do every day, and I advise everyone, and I'm advising you right now to pray for him. And to pray also for those who advise him and work with him every day. I think we all have a moral obligation to do that. Now, that being said, I do believe that President Biden is in the wrong. His policies, again, on life and marriage and family and religious freedom are immoral. They're evil. But from a spiritual point of view, I'd like to highlight just two fundamental matters of Christian formation and of spiritual direction that few people seem to be addressing. And I think they're important to be addressed. And I don't want to get too technical, but I think this would offer and shed a new light in the conversation. One is the notion of unity of life. And the other is a much more prosaic and practical question, and that's the practice of fraternal correction. Now, on the unity of life, it is a technical term. It's used in theology and magisterial documents very strongly in the Second Vatican Council. And there, the concept, the notion is to refer to the inseparable unity between faith and life. An essential responsibility of any Catholic parent, but also of any spiritual director worth his or her salt, is precisely to guide and to form a person to integrate fully what one believes with the way one lives. You may recall that Paul VI wrote, and I quote, that the split between the gospel and culture is without a doubt the drama of our time. This became very clear to him when he witnessed the onslaught of criticism from within the church regarding his magisterial teaching on birth control. The split between the gospel and culture can only take place when enough individuals divorce their lives from their faith. So it is a personal issue before it becomes a cultural issue. And once it becomes a cultural issue, it has a detrimental effect on many individuals and therefore on the culture. So as I think and consider President Biden's Catholicism, I keep in mind, and I think all of us have to keep in mind, that he may just be as much of a product of our culture as the cause of the culture we face. You know, as a US Senator, he certainly embraced some very immoral positions. But now, as the President of the United States, he exercises far greater influence, not only here in the United States, but in the whole world. Well, here are some words from the Johannine Gospel that can help here as I keep going forward in what I'm trying to say. It's John 17. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, even as I'm not of the world. I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I'm not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you send me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. May I think strong words from the Gospel of St. John, and I think this is really ultimately what we're seeing not being lived, what we're seeing in action. Christians are to be in the world to bring the light of Christ into it, but without becoming worldly, without conforming to the world and what the world has to offer. In other words, there needs to be a unity of life in each Catholic, in each Christian. Our faith is not something external or added or accessory to our lives. Our faith permeates and guides and enlivens every dimension of our existence, our family, our work, our friends, finance, politics, recreation, everything. So our faith cannot be reduced, as the world is trying to brainwash now into thinking that our faith has to be reduced to times of prayer and to going to church on Sundays. Saint Josemaria, the founder of Opus Dei, I'm a priest of Opus Dei, spoke often about the need to live one's faith in society. And specifically, he would speak often about avoiding what he called a double life. which is the opposite of unity of life. And he wrote, and I quote, "I wanted to warn them, people, of the temptation so common then and now to lead a kind of double life. On the one hand, an inner life, a life related to God, and on the other, as something separate and distinct, their professional, social, and family lives, made up of small earthly realities. No, we cannot lead a double life," unquote. And Pope Francis took St. Josemaría's point one step further. During a homily at Casa Santa Marta, he preached, and I quote, "What is the difference between sinning and scandalizing? The difference is that one who sins repents, but the one who scandalizes does not repent. He continues to sin, but pretends to be a Christian. It's the double life. And the double life of a Christian does much harm, so much harm. The one who scandalizes deceives, and where there is deception, there is no Spirit of God." Now think about that. But some of President Biden's actions are clearly evil. The policies he's pushing regarding life are responsible for the death of thousands of babies every year. But he goes to Mass every Sunday and prays, he says. His behavior and the rationalizing of his behavior is causing scandal among many Catholics. And the words and actions of some bishops are making the scandal even worse. During his visit to the United States in 2008, Pope Benedict XVI highlighted what he saw as a particular acute American problem. Let me just read you one paragraph from one of his addresses. "Perhaps America's brand of secularism poses a particular problem. It allows for professing belief in God and respects the public role of religion and the churches, but at the same time, it can subtly reduce religious belief to a lowest common denominator. Faith becomes a passive acceptance of certain things out there are true, but without practical relevance for everyday life. The result is the growing separation of faith from life, living as if God did not exist. This is aggravated by an individualistic and eclectic approach to faith and religion, far from a Catholic approach to thinking with the church. Each person then believes he or she has a right to pick and choose, maintaining external social bonds, but without an integral interior conversion to the law of Christ. Consequently, rather than being transformed and renewed in mind, Christians are easily tempted to conform themselves to the spirit of this age." And so I think there's so many things here, and I could talk for 15 hours, and I can't. I only have a few minutes. But how did this happen? How did we get to this point? There is a devastating failure on the part of Catholic schools, pastors, and bishops. They have failed to help Joe Biden and so many Catholic politicians acquire a unity of life. They've been allowed to divorce faith from life. In fact, I think we continue to fail today. I'm not absolving all of those politicians. They have their own freedom and their own capacity, but we have failed them. The church has failed them in many ways. What is needed is really deep catechetical work, a serious work of formation in Catholic teaching and practice of the faith in accordance to one's circumstances, a formation that's fully and is integral, that acquires every dimension of a person. What is needed is teachers who teach, and pastors who preach and guide, and bishops who who are faithful and courageous and who are not afraid to go against the world's dictatorship or relativism. Again, Pope Benedict addressed this very issue with the bishops of the United States. Here's a quote from the Ad Limina visit a few years ago. He told the bishops, here we see the need for an engaged, articulate, and well-formed Catholic laity endowed with a strong critical sense vis-a-vis the dominant culture and with the courage to counter a reductive secularism which legitimizes the church's participation in public debate about the issues which are determining the future of American society. The preparation of committed lay leaders and the presentation of a convincing articulation of the Christian vision of man and society remain a primary task of the church in your country. As essential components of the new evangelizations, these concerns must shape the vision and goals of catechetical programs at every level. As a spiritual director, I would try to help President Biden understand how he needs to integrate faith with life. And in order to do this, I would have to guide him to understand how every dimension of his life, that all the decisions he makes from the Oval Office need to be guided by faith and morals, both from the natural moral law and the moral teachings of the Catholic Church. It's an arduous task, and really, in the end, what President Biden needs is a good spiritual director, one who's not afraid, one who thinks with the church. And on this subject, I want to say something. It's the second point that I wanted to make, spiritual point, and this is fraternal correction. In the gospel, Jesus teaches that a brother should correct a brother who's in the wrong. It is an evangelical practice that unfortunately has almost disappeared in the church. Fraternal correction is no longer taught or encouraged in seminaries. I'm a spiritual director at a well-known seminary. And therefore, if seminarians are not taught, priests don't practice it, and therefore bishops don't practice fraternal correction. And this has devastating effects. In my view, it's a tragedy of enormous consequences. So, as a spiritual director helping the bishops, I would encourage them to reinstall and encourage and push the practice of fraternal correction among their seminarians and among their presbytery. And then also, of course, among themselves. I would encourage them to correct their brother bishops when they err. To do so, to correct them in a spirit of prayer and humility and refined charity, but to do so. And certainly, I would urge them never, ever to disagree as they do in public. It scandalizes the faithful. They should talk to one another, even when sometimes it's not clear the way, but they have to always present a united front. Biden's presidency has caused much public disagreement among the bishops, and therefore, and unfortunately, much scandal which could be avoided if they would practice fraternal correction. I remember, just a quick aside, but when I was working on my doctorate in Rome, I was so privileged to be able to work at two of the ordinary synods of bishops there. And one of them was precisely Pope Benedict's first synod as Vicar of Rome, as Pope. And it was the synod on the Eucharist. And normally the rules and proceedings of these synods are, but the Pope never speaks until the end normally. And in this synod on the Eucharist, when the secretary of the synod made his opening remarks, and then all of a sudden the Pope leaned towards him and whispered something, and then the secretary of the synod said, well, the Holy Father wants to say something, and there was this kind of ooh sense in all of the synod. And Pope Benedict said two things, two beautiful things. He said, well, we're all gathered for a very important synod, is the synod on the Eucharist. And I want to just highlight 2 points as we begin this synod. The first one, he said, this is the synod on the Eucharist, the central mystery, the central sacrament, the apex of all the sacraments. And therefore, the best thing we can do to prepare is by all of us going to confession during this synod. We encourage all those cardinals and bishops, big sinners, to go to confession. It was great. But the second thing he said, and now I want to remind you of the evangelical practice of fraternal correction and how important it is, and the fact that we're losing it. And he said, I urge you, let's correct one another while we're in this synod. Beautiful, beautiful. So, well, let me end in a high positive note here, because I've said some strong things and some things that are hard, are difficult. But I want to end on a positive note. I am very optimistic. I'm very hopeful. In his memoirs, Cardinal Gagnon, such a wonderful man and who did so much good for the church, many of you may know some of. But in his memoirs, he relates a conversation he had with Saint John Paul II. And he writes, they were having a conversation, that's the context, about difficult situations and problems in the church, precisely regarding family and marriage. And he writes, the Holy Father told me that error makes its way because truth is not taught. We must teach the truth, not by attacking those who teach errors, because that would never end. They're too numerous. We have to teach the truth. And he told me that the truth has a grace attached to it. Anytime we speak the truth, an internal grace of God accompanies that truth. The truth may not immediately enter in the mind and heart of those to whom we talk, but the grace of God is there, and at the time they need it, God will open their heart and they will accept it. The Holy Father said that error does not have grace attached to it. Yes, I believe that God will open their hearts and they will accept it. Truth has a grace attached to it. This is what we need to remember. And this is what, even in the midst of very dark and difficult times, this is why we need to remain hopeful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Luke. You succeeded beautifully in accomplishing the purposes we had discussed in preparing, and even better than I expected, by ending with the grace attached to truth, because as I said at the beginning this morning, my hope for this conversation was an exploration of possibilities in search of truth. And you've given us much to think about and much to be grateful for. I'm looking to see if there are any new questions for you, Father. Not seeing any that have come in already. I think it will be better to proceed and let you answer questions later if you're able to be with us later. And I know your schedule may preclude that, but not seeing any. Let me just ask, Father, do you think you'll be able to rejoin us for the panel discussion from 1:30 to 2:15?
Probably not, unfortunately. I'm going to try, but I don't want to make say that I will. I will try, and if I do make it, it will be great. I'm doing my best here.
Well, it'll be a bonus if we get to see you later. Thank you so much. All right. With that, I'd like to move on to introduce the second speaker of our second session. and his name is John McGreevy, and he's the McEnany Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame, where he's the former dean of the College of Arts and Letters. And he's a veteran of this Scarpa conference, having traveled to Villanova to speak at a conference many years ago. And I first just discovered John, as many of us did, by his just outstanding history of Catholicism, the Catholic people, and the life of the church in this experiment in democratic living over many years. And it's just a delight to welcome you back and to thank you for all your work. And I'm very interested to hear what you have to contribute to our conversation today. John, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick and Professor Brennan, and thank you to Mr. Scarpa for sponsoring such a wonderful series, and thanks to my predecessors on the panel. I have to say this will be quite different. This will be than our prior speakers in terms of tone, in terms of style, and in terms of discipline. It'll be different in terms of tone in that I think if we were to sit down for a drink, which I would love to do with our prior speakers, we might have some disagreements. I don't think Bishop should deny communion to Joe Biden because there's a position on abortion. I don't think the American Catholic bishops need to be more firm in how they deal with President Biden. I don't think it's terribly problematic as a historian for bishops to disagree in public. But I suspect it would take a long time for us to persuade one another of the other person's view or our own view on this topic. So what I thought I would do today is speak as an historian. And the reason I want to do that is just to give us a little bit of perspective on the particular puzzle of President Biden, abortion, and the current moment. I thought I would do that by sharing screen. I hope this works. Patrick, can you have someone enable me to share screen?
Let me see. Victoria or Nicole, are you at hand to be able to assist with that?
Says I should be able. Okay, here we go, I think. And
there you go.
Good. Did that turn out okay?
Yes.
Great. So, like I said, I'm going to think a little bit for my 15 minutes of fame here as an historian, just as a plug and for you to do your early Christmas shopping for the year 2022. This comes out of the thinking I've been doing over the last several years for a kind of big book that I'm writing, big certainly in terms of pages. We'll see how good it is in terms of quality, entitled Catholicism, A Global History from the French Revolution to Pope Francis. That'll be published with Norton. And that's enabled me or prompted me to think a little bit about how history informs our current moment. So let's step back for a second and go very big picture. If we think about Vatican II in the immediate post-Vatican II era, and we asked ourselves, what was, if we can put it this way, a global Catholic strategy? It was primarily, I would argue, engagement with the world. There was a sense that coming out of Gaudium et Spes and coming out of a disenchantment with the Catholic experience during World War II and the crisis of Catholic institutions during the fascist period during the 1930s, a sense that Catholics had become too enclosed within their own institutions, too isolated from the wider patterns of society, and needed to have stronger engagement with the world. It might actually be one of the 2 or 3 dominant messages that comes out of the council. And so naturally that informs a lot of the work of the council in the first 15 years. Here I have a photo of Paul VI, obviously the Pope who completed the council after his election in 1963, and then that first decade and a half or so of implementation. Looked at historically, I think we could say there were some pretty impressive successes in this period. I could talk about several, but I would highlight a novel and enduring focus on social justice and development. We tend to think Catholics have always been concerned with the gap between rich and poor nations or the problems of inequality. I don't think that's quite right. We could talk about how Catholics thought about the economy in the early 20th century. It was rather different. And that's a post-conciliar form of engagement that seems to me have been quite successful and enduring. There were also, as one would expect, pretty significant failures in this immediate period after the council. There were failures of governance, which I'll touch on again in a second, but just note that at a moment when most institutions in developed societies, and by that I mean universities, I mean corporations, I mean some forms of even state institutions, were developing more forms of shared governments, more forms unevenly, but still broadly, this is the pattern of transparency. That wasn't happening within church structures. And I think viewed from the vantage point of 2021, that was the great omission. It was not talked about fundamentally at the council, except for a discussion of the Synod of Bishops, but that was the great omission of the council. That was a terrible failure. The second failure was the failure around personnel. It's well known, but I think worth highlighting exactly how chaotic the first decade after the council was in terms of personnel. The number of clergy and women religious who leave their orders is, or the diocesan priesthood, is almost astonishing. In the US, it's 10% of all clergy within a short period of years, mostly young clergy. In other countries, it's not that dissimilar. There are exceptions of that, Poland, Ireland, a few countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but broadly, a massive evacuation of personnel, especially among women religious. And then finally, I think a naivete about institutions, which is ironic because if Catholics were good at anything in what I call the Ultramontane era, the era that really goes from the end of the French Revolution up until, say, the 1950s, if they were good at anything, it wasn't writing books, so they did some of that. It wasn't creating art. It was building institutions, master virtuoso institution builders. And so there's a certain irony or even sadness about the fact that there was a naivete, I believe, in that first generation after the council about sustaining distinctly Catholic institutions in the rush to open them up to the world. As a side note, and I think I'll leave this for any question and answer, there's a really interesting historical discussion going on right now about whether or not Vatican II was the cause of any decline in this first period, or whether or not without Vatican II it would have been more severe. And I have to say there are interesting arguments on both sides. One thing I'll note right here, though, is this is the moment, this period from 65 to 78, where we really start to see patterns of disaffiliation emerge. That is significantly declining, although not radically declining, we'll get to that in a minute, patterns of mass attendance, for women religious in particular, an absolute collapse of new entries into religious orders, and a very significant decline of entry of men into the priesthood. Okay. Second era, broadly, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, 1978 to 2013. If we could identify a strategy here, we would say a belief in a kind of firm identity, especially on sexual and gender issues, much comparison at the time, and this is obviously within the lifetime of most of the people on this Zoom call, with mainline Protestants and the idea of a hard church, a church that asks a lot of its members is going to sustain them and thrive. I would argue a focus on charisma and circumventing elites. John Paul II spoke to more human beings, we believe, than any other person in history, extraordinarily charismatic figure. And part of a broader sense that liberal elites, certainly in the developed West, had captured government institutions and the media and even the church to some extent. And the strategy was to circumvent them and reach more theoretically, at least, devout working class masses. There were some successes, I think, in this era too, if we look at it historically. Certainly a continuation of the focus on social justice and interreligious and ecumenical work came to a kind of new height. My own view is that events like World Youth Day and the kind of ceaseless papal travel, although part of that kind of focus on charisma and circumventing elites, did have their own successes. And they recognized, especially for young people, that religion was no longer becoming embedded in the culture, but becoming an individual choice. there was a more sectarian, and I would say almost a-Catholic view of institutions that actually lost a good bit of the sophistication of the ultramontane era and the ability at once to be an institution for Catholics and to speak to the wider society. During this period, we see an even much sharper decline in Catholic practice, pretty much, I would add, around the world. Now, there are some exceptions to that, significant ones in sub-Saharan Africa and the Philippines, potentially Mexico. But there is a broad decline, even in places that you might not expect. In East Asia, most of Latin America, certainly Western Europe. Even now, we're seeing the data from Eastern Europe. So significant decline in Catholic practice. And the much discussed new evangelization of this period has to grapple with that fact. Alienation around gender and sexuality is profound. The best studies by historians and sociologists of alienation in Western Europe and in North America, and to some extent now in Latin America, are finding that alienation of women, alienation around issues of gays and lesbians, and other issues that would have been predictable in 1965 are causing quite a bit of this alienation. And one striking thing has been its class dimensions. That is, middle and upper class Catholics are now, with the exception of Latinos, significantly more likely to practice their faith than working class Catholics. And that's something I think quite important for the future. So if you do that capsule history of the period after the Second Vatican Council with one eye on the United States and another eye on the world, you do start to ask yourself, is secularization theory wrong? I've been doing the history and then administration business for quite a long time now, since the 1990s. And when my first book, which is about Catholics and race relations, I made the argument among other historians and kind of bet my career on the idea that the US was an exception to patterns of secularization in Canada or in Western Europe. And the Weberian model, here we have the great Max Weber himself, of secularization being a natural product of disenchantment and a natural product of elite education, not fitting for the US. Well, the most recent data, certainly for Catholics, suggests that it might. It's not quite the same pattern that Weber predicted. It's not occurring on quite the same timeline. But the last 20 years, and Francis Maier referred to this, have really seen a rapid secularization, especially among young people. And to repeat myself, the best evidence from David Campbell and others on why that occurs now points to alienation around women's issues, gay lesbian issues, and a sharp disjunction in social class. So let's get back to the issue of Joe Biden, abortion, and Catholicism. The abortion debate, again looked at comparatively in the United States, has been unusually intense since the early 1970s. And I don't actually believe historians have quite figured out why that is. We have some partial explanations. One explanation is the kind of preeminence of rights talk in the United States. And Marianne Glendon a long time ago made this argument that in Western Europe, more communal, socialist, and Christian democratic cultures were able to come to a kind of agreement on abortion that simply wasn't possible in the United States, where the issue became politicized fairly quickly by the early 1980s. That is, Republicans being identified as pro-life, Democrats primarily as pro-choice. And that was a contrast with Western Europe and Latin America. Again, I think there's more to say there, but I think that's about right. And so there's been particular pressure on Catholic politicians in the United States that there really hasn't been in Chile or in what was first West Germany and then became a united Germany, in that the abortion issue is controversial, but once the society comes to a basic resolution of the issue, in West Germany, abortion is technically illegal, but practically legal through most of a woman's pregnancy. In Chile, it's recently been legalized with pretty severe restrictions. Then actually, there isn't discussion of denying communion to particular politicians or it doesn't come up with the same kind of rhythmic regularity that it does in the United States because it's a partisan issue. And that's a peculiarity. There is an American exceptionalism there that has made the abortion issue and its relationship to Catholicism a particular case of American exceptionalism. So how do we locate President Biden? You know, he's part of this hinge generation that was raised in the pre-conciliar church, but also welcomed the Second Vatican Council. He too, as our previous speakers have pointed out, has been enmeshed in the polarization within the US political culture. All of his ideological and I think theological instincts go toward a sort of moderate pro-choice view on abortion with some restrictions, the Hyde Amendment, other things that at one point in his career he supported. And he's pulled, pushed, dragged to a much more extreme position, which again marks the polarization of the abortion issue within the United States. Joe Biden, in a sense, can't be a Christian Democrat as in Chile or in Brazil or in Germany because the abortion issue in the United States has been polarized between two very dramatic extremes. I do think it's likely, and I know our previous speakers are disappointed with this, but it does seem likely that Biden will be part of a broad Catholic reorientation around Francis, a focus much less on the so-called non-negotiable issues like abortion or same-sex marriage, and much more on issues like climate and inequality. Within the US, just to note this, and I'm a bit surprised it hasn't been mentioned so far today, I don't think Biden's primary Catholic task is around the issues of abortion or religious freedom, or for that matter, climate change or inequality. The primary Catholic task, a task for both Catholics and the commonweal, is to stabilize democratic government. We're at a moment, I'm teaching American politics actually at 2:30 today, a fairly sober view of this, where basic tasks of democratic governance, basic the ability of the Republican Party to be a partner in democratic governance are at question. And truly, one of Biden's core tasks has to be to try and stabilize that situation. Within the church, I think there will be a challenge to keep the US church tethered to the global church. It seems to me there's more distance there between the US church and the global church, certainly under Francis, than there has been in a long time. And it'll be very interesting, obviously, to see how that plays out. I would note on the political issue, we're at a kind of reverse of the 1930s, which I spend a lot of time talking about in the book. When democracy was at its most secure in the US and Anglophone world, at its most vulnerable in South America and parts of Europe, like Italy and Germany and Croatia and other countries that were predominantly Catholic. And that led to a long discussion in the 1950s and 1960s. Could Catholic cultures support democratic governance? We're well beyond that discussion, but we're in a very different point now where democratic governance, it seems to me, is at risk, not only in the United States and in other places as well, but is at significant risk in the United States. Well, the next 60 years bring. One of the things I do in the book is talk quite a bit about Joseph Ratzinger and his extraordinary and fruitful career. These quotes are from a talk he wrote for Cardinal Frings, effectively his boss, the Cardinal of Cologne, in 1961. And a speech he gave to the German bishops, West German bishops, the day after the opening of the council. And the point I would make there is I wonder if we're at the end of an era within US Catholicism and moving towards something new. And by that, I mean the particular issues that have animated so much of the public discussion of US Catholicism over the last 30 years, high voltage culture war issues. What will happen to them? I don't think same-sex marriage is going to be revisited. I don't think we're going to have, if Roe versus Wade is overruled, I think it'll go back to the states. And I don't imagine hugely dramatic shifts. And so 60 years from now, what will the relationship of church and politics look in the United States? We won't have resolved the questions that are animating us now, but sometimes we just get to a different point. I've been reading the Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie and Father Akpa. And it's just a striking fact that I'll end with, that two of the most prominent novelists in the Anglophone world are Nigerian Catholics. And they're deeply Catholic, if fraught in their relationship with the institutional church. I myself think Akpa is the superior artist. And he describes himself as a novelist writing for Catholics in the global South. And of course, we know that 70% of Catholics soon will be living in the global South. He described himself as a Catholic writing in the global South in the tradition of Gaudium et Spes, the last doctrine of the Second Vatican Council, and the focus away from what he calls abstract theology toward the issues faced by the poor. Hard to know if that will be the direction taken by Catholicism in the next 60 years, but I think there are a lot of things pointing toward the observation that the US and the particular configuration of issues in US Catholicism that has animated many of us for much of our adult lifetime may already be becoming an outlier and not the norm. Thank you. I'll try and disengage from the PowerPoint.
John, thank you very much. I was tempted to do my Christmas shopping while you were speaking, but
well, it's not ready yet. It's but well, it is.
I was going to pre-order.
Published next year.
Well, it sounds like the task for which you were the man, and as I began by saying, always profited from your earlier work, and this is even more ambitious. And the anticipatory fruits were evident in your marvelous divisions of the period and explanations and identification of the questions as they bear on the present situation. Thank you. I see there's a question here from Christian Riley, another one of our outstanding students, and I'm giving students where possible priority in the queue. So here is Christian Riley's question. Do you think there are consequences for the Catholic Church, specifically non-Catholics' view of the Church, if Catholic leaders do not condemn President Biden's actions regarding abortion and gender reassignment surgeries? And that's for you, Professor
Yeah,
Green.
So, you're testing a little bit the limits of my knowledge. I don't know much about President Biden's actions regarding gender reassignment surgeries. This seems to me, though, to be honest, a very small issue. On both sides, I think the frantic movement of the left to say that the complex issues around transgender identity is the next civil rights movement should be checked. But I also think the frantic movement on the right to make this much more important than it actually is disappointing and an evasion of the major issues in our society. Abortion is quite different. But no, I don't think the bishop should begin President Biden's term by simply condemning his actions on abortion and not developing a more thoughtful way of approaching a political figure, as has been discussed earlier, whose relationship to Catholic social thought is quite complex and sympathetic in some dimensions and less sympathetic in others. And you only would assume that the bishop should immediately condemn President Biden's action regarding abortion if you assume abortion is the fundamental issue. And I don't. I think the social tradition is more complex than that. And I think we're moving out of an era where that assumption was, I think, misleadingly articulated. And so, no, I would not favor that.
Thank you, John. Here we have another question from Ambassador Kamick, and I'll read it for you, John. Why was there a dramatic decline in women religious following the Second Vatican Council? Could it have been avoided then or now? And you anticipated this earlier, but I'm interested to hear your answer.
So I actually think it's one of these topics that we need to study more and hasn't been studied very well. But I would say two things. First of all, the kind of reorientation of the women's religious orders and the men's religious orders in the decade after the council was chaotic and fraught. Lots of different things are intersecting, including the emergence of kind of second wave feminism, new ideas about sexuality, and new ideas about what it means to live in a religious community. Not all of those were unsuccessful, but it was a very fraught, turbulent period. And I think looking back at it, it's fair to say, in a number of ways, the leaders of those orders didn't know what they were doing. Now, I have great sympathy for stumbling administrators because I've been one myself, but that I think that's a fair assessment. Going forward, after that chaotic first decade, I think the reason is fundamental. It was the inability to sever the link between ordination and power within the church. And women seeking full-time commitment to lives in the church broadly are not going to find it in women's religious orders. And there's just much more alienation. And so I think that's one of the great tragedies of the last 30 or 40 years, at a moment when you could make an argument that the biggest social history change of the 20th century, I would argue, is the movement from rural to urban. That is the movement of people from the countryside into cities. An astonishing change that we don't talk enough about. Number two, I would say, is the new opportunities for women. And just like I said, broadly within the church, shared governance, transparency, which is unevenly but happening in other institutions, doesn't happen. So too, women don't get leadership positions, and broadly. And has huge effects on, I think, the sustainability of women's religious orders.
John, there's a related question here, and I think this will be the last one we have time to take. You mentioned failures with regard to women personnel throughout much of the church's recent history. Pope Francis's predecessor reprimanded U.S. sisters for espousing radical feminist views. The Leadership Conference of Women Religious was subjected to a program for reform and oversight. Do you foresee a continuing trend of alienation of women in the church, given that they are barred from the College of Cardinals and from participating at Vatican synods?
Well, I would thank you for the question, but I would slightly reframe it and just repeat more or less what I just said. The inability of the church broadly, and there are lots of exceptions to this generalization, but of the church broadly, to sever the link between ordination and authority has been devastating. And so it's not necessarily an argument that women have to be ordained as clergy. It's not necessarily that women have to be members of the College of Cardinals. It's, of course, absurd that they don't participate at Vatican synods or don't participate fully in those. But that's the fundamental question. And I'm not new in saying that. Mary Douglas, the great English anthropologist, was making that argument in the 1970s when she was arguing, by the way, against women's ordination. But she said this is an argument that only works if you can sever the link between authority and ordination. And if you can't do that, the credibility of the church in a society that's had a revolution in its approach to what are the roles of women, how do women think about their professional lives, it's just the air that we breathe now, you're just not going to be credible.
Good. Thank you very much, John. You mentioned that you have to teach a class this afternoon at 2:30. Do you anticipate being able to be at our roundtable before that?
Yes, but I will have to leave kind of like right at 2:10, I'm afraid, to go browbeat my students. So but I will be here at 1:30.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thanks for all the questions. I would now like to introduce the third speaker for session 2, and he's Joseph Capizzi, Ordinary Professor of Ethics and Moral Theology at the Catholic University of America, where he is also the director of the Human Ecology Institute. And it's been a long time since I've seen Joe, but I've admired his work too for a long time, and we've had a lot of good times together. He's not a lawyer, but his wife is a Washington lawyer, so he's an honorary participant in that way too. But he's a serious moral theologian with very interesting things to say from a discipline that I knew needed to be represented here, and I could think of nobody more skilled and possessed of more care for the church than Joe to address these questions. So welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Patrick. It sounds like you need to expand your circle of moral theologian friends then, if I'm all you can come up with. But look, I'm super happy to be here. Thank you for putting this together. And of course, thanks to your staff and to the Scarpa family for supporting this important conference. Thanks also to my colleagues on this. I've really enjoyed listening to all of you so far. And one of the things I love about these kinds of events is you'll see often how they fall together so beautifully, even though none of us have coordinated our comments. And there are, of course, also little gaps that need to be filled in by the questioners. So this is going to be a lot of fun. No one will be surprised to learn that Americans are divided by party lines over President Joe Biden's Catholicism. Data from the Pew Research Center show that Republicans and Democrats have vastly different views about how religious Biden is and whether he talks about his religious faith too much, too little, or the right amount. This political divide extends even to Biden's fellow Catholics, who are deeply split along party lines over whether his views about abortion should disqualify him for receiving communion, for instance. Fewer Republicans than Democrats say Biden is Catholic. Similarly, more Republicans than Democrats find him less religious or not at all religious. Regardless of our opinions about the man, as Professor Massimo Fagioli at Villanova has argued, Biden made his Catholicism a key component of his campaign, explicitly referring to it, to its scriptures and hymns, to its saints and theologians, and to its magisterial teachings. Rather than seeming to shy from his Catholicism or to downplay it, or even to employ it only in certain contexts, Biden embraced it so often that it operated as a permanent feature of his autobiography, as present as his homey references to growing up in Delaware. Historians like Professor Fagioli will have much to study to help us understand how Catholics have moved from campaigns in the face of virulent anti-Catholicism, as in Al Smith's and to a lesser extent John Kennedy's, to Biden's. In Biden's case, his campaign understood his Catholicism as an asset towards his getting elected, and in that in itself is significant. As a theologian, however, my interest rests elsewhere. Put simply, my interests nestle in the middle of a claim at the outset of Professor Fagioli's excellent book on Biden and Catholicism, where he writes, Biden's election represents a vindication of the history of American Catholicism as a history of the search for a compatibility between the church and pluralist constitutional democracy. I'm not sure I agree with Professor Fagioli. I'm not sure the lesson to be drawn from Biden's election says anything about the compatibility of the church and pluralistic democracy, instead of saying something about the denuded kind of Catholicism that can succeed in US politics. According to the same study I referred to before, 75% of American Jews know Biden is Catholic, and 6 in 10 Protestants, and nearly 2/3 of self-described atheists and agnostics. Biden's Catholicism is a secret to almost no one, with only Black Protestants being under 50% in their awareness of his faith. One might conclude Biden didn't win election despite his faith, but perhaps in some part because of it. Being Catholic was no disadvantage to his chances for election, as he and his campaign understood. In that sense, then, one might conclude with Professor Fagioli that in Biden's victory, we see the vindication of the Catholic search for compatibility between Catholicism and pluralist constitutional democracy. So why do I hesitate in joining that conclusion? Let me raise some questions, none of which I'll explore from a social scientific perspective. By the vindication of the history of American Catholicism as a history of the search for compatibility between the church and pluralist constitutional democracy, Fagioli might be emphasizing an issue within historical study itself. The historical approach that understands American Catholic history to be primarily about the search for compatibility between the church and democracy might really be the focus of that claim. By Biden's election, Professor Fagioli might mean that historical approach has been vindicated against rival American histories. Coming to that conclusion seems strange to me. The idea that an approach to American Catholic history is implicated by so recent an election and even vindicated, I find curious and wonder what would count as evidence or counter-evidence to that claim. It seems premature to regard as closed or settled the right way of understanding the history of the relationship of Catholicism to American politics. At the minimum, one would be forced to ask questions about the character of Catholicism Biden expresses before concluding that his election vindicates one understanding of American Catholic history over another. It's possible, and maybe even more likely, that what Professor Fagioli means is that Biden's election simply shows the compatibility of the church and pluralist constitutional democracy in some final way. Against those who doubt the compatibility of democracy and Catholicism, we have Biden's campaign victory and his employment of his faith to that end. His faith was a key component of that victory. If any thought, as some still do, that democracy and Catholicism couldn't coexist or weren't compatible, Biden's victory seems to argue convincingly to the contrary. But doesn't that prove a little bit too much? Haven't statements from popes and councils since Pope Leo XIII in Immortali Dei, which is 1885, and again in Libertas in 1888, and for subsequent popes since then, expressed the compatibility of the democracy in the church? And hasn't that been inclusive of the sort of pluralist constitutional democracy that we have in the US? Haven't we also had countless successful politicians at all levels of governance, elected and unelected? What does Biden's election show that theirs does not? The point of these questions is not to get semantic about Professor Fagioli's claim as to understand the theological significance of President Biden's election. In other words, it may prove it says more about the current state of US Catholicism than it does about anything else. Perhaps even that public Catholicism is translucent or empty or provides merely a screen onto which to project other deeper commitments. For instance, we have to consider that the asset of Biden's Catholicism wasn't about Catholicism per se, but instead about his being a person of faith. The point here is that Catholicism, or being a democratic Catholic more particularly, says more about the kind of American Biden is rather than that he's Catholic. Biden's Catholicism might suggest, for instance, a commitment to certain middle-class democratic values, a general and acceptable faithfulness that is reassuring and associated with the accepting permissive attitudes towards immigration and abortion, inclusivity and diversity, general commitments to justice and restoring democratic stability, and certain kinds of oppositions, as in opposition to Trumpism, to popularism, to nativism. In other words, as Biden put it in his autobiography and in a passage that I think Patrick read himself at the beginning in his beginning comments, Biden says, "I'm as much a cultural Catholic as I am a theological Catholic. My idea of self, of family, of community, of the wider world comes straight from my religion. It's not so much the Bible, the Beatitudes, the Ten Commandments, the sacraments, or the prayers I learned. It's the culture." The Catholicism described here by Biden is miles from being dogmatic or beliefs-based. From his Catholicism, he picked up a culture orienting him towards the world, but which does not draw heavily on the more religious components of his faith. It is neither in your face nor on his sleeve. Biden has spoken with feeling and precision about this Catholic culture that he's learned from and which inform his idea of the wider world. It is no doubt sincere. We can explore more deeply the culture upon which this faith rests. We saw some concrete evidence of the role this cultural faith played during the campaign, when in 2019, Biden was the last Democratic candidate to express his support for repealing the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits federal funding for abortions. Biden, as we all know, had supported the Hyde Amendment for 4 decades before this about face. The New York Times reported that Biden ascribed to his Roman Catholicism his reluctance to support the amendment's repeal. Implicitly, Biden's reluctance acknowledges the evil of abortion as understood by his Catholicism and expresses a kind of compromise. By, in the past, supporting the Hyde Amendment, he supports those recognizing the evil of abortion and who resist having tax money pay for them. On the other hand, despite recognizing that his church opposes abortion, the 2019 flip on the Hyde Amendment was not his first departure from the moral teaching of the church. He arrived in the Senate in 1973 at the age of 30 and declared Roe wrongly decided, and having gone too far in granting women autonomy over their pregnant bodies. And of course, one of the very first acts of his as president was to repeal on January 28th of this year the global gag rule, or the Mexico City policy that had been in place and fought over by Democratic and Republican administrations since 1984, which prohibited U.S. funding of abortions overseas, of overseas abortions, abortion counseling, and referrals. His cultural Catholicism, in other words, exercises some, but not determinative force on these kinds of grave questions. Biden's inconsistencies on abortions have been consistent with his understanding of Catholicism and its role in his public life. When John Kennedy ran for president, I remember being so proud that he was Catholic, he told the Wilmington News Journal in 2005. But he had to prove that he wasn't ruled by his beliefs. I'm with John Kennedy on the role that religion ought to play in politics. In other words, a Catholic in U.S. politics should not be ruled by his or her beliefs. Again, I think Biden has been remarkably consistent in this view that the faith he exhibits politically is cultural and not beliefs-based. In other words, we might hesitate to see in Biden the compatibility of Catholicism and American constitutional democracy. We can understand the temptation to understand a person's political life in that way, and not merely from a kind of transactional place where political success seems to require the sidelining of difficult beliefs. Much of our culture shapes all of us into thinking that religious or religious-type beliefs must be sidelined in this way. That sidelining is reinforced by the cultural presupposition that religion is mainly a private affair, and many of us, including Biden, agree that forcing beliefs on others is counter not merely to good politics, but to good neighborliness. Common human weakness inclines us to do what we judge necessary to avoid being ostracized by our peers. In some of my favorite passages of the City of God, Augustine describes our love for the sweetness of life that causes us to avoid being bitter to the wicked. Most of us, Augustine is saying, are not wicked men. We don't do wicked things, but we're weak, unwilling to rebuke crimes that we would not join with the wicked in committing, he writes, because we're attached to our well-being and our reputation. This is a kind of parking lot or country club ethics that Augustine has described. And yet, of course, it's important to question this, right? First, of course, these views are plainly absurd. The notion of forcing beliefs upon people is merely a lazy way of allowing particular sorts of beliefs, religious beliefs, to be labeled taboo and beyond the pale of polite society when, and only when, they challenge polite society values. As I said above, it's quite possible the faith that President Biden wore in public during his campaign was precisely this kind of faith. For many, his Catholicism signaled not that he was a man of faith, but a man of this faith, the one that accepts the privatization of beliefs on certain kinds of issues. Second, and complementary to this point, is that belief is only sidelined regarding the use of certain beliefs to undermine values at the heart of polite society. The beliefs supporting values at the heart of polite society are, on the other hand, quite acceptable. There's nothing wrong with using the Christian language of human dignity to rally citizens around immigration reform or against the death penalty. But it's unacceptable to use the same language to argue in defense of the unborn. I don't raise these kinds of questions to condemn President Biden in a manner that then would be different for any president. But perhaps that's the nature of this condemnation in itself. Biden is just like every other US president in his understanding of the role of faith in his political life, and his Catholicism has actually little to do with his presidency. A similar kind of analysis could be done for other Democratic and Republican politicians. Part of the explanation for this is, in Augustinian terms, that any city, any political society cannot be a just city. To quote Robert Dodaro, Augustine certainly believes that all political regimes are depraved, though he admits some are less depraved than others and that some are less depraved at certain times in their history than at other times. Our lot, in other words, is to be governed by broken men and women and to be governed as broken men and women ourselves. Despite that pessimism, however, Augustine does believe that the Christian can nonetheless pursue the kingdom as a citizen of the city of God, even in the role of ruler. An opportunity to make more coherent one's belief and one's politics presents itself at that point. Augustine raises this point in the city of God, and more particularly in his letters exchanged with the Roman provincial leader Macedonius. The way a ruler rules expresses his beliefs. He may claim to believe one thing, but his rule either confirms those are his belief or betrays them. In the early 400s, Augustine writes to Macedonius, imploring him to commute a death sentence. Macedonius responds by rejecting Augustine's intervention. If the Lord forbade sin so strongly that a sinner is offered no more than one opportunity to repent, Macedonius responds to Augustine, how can Augustine argue on religious grounds that any crime whatsoever should be forgiven? Augustine responds, of course, and over the course of their exchange of multiple letters to each other, Augustine convinces Macedonius to commute the sentence. By this act, he tells Macedonius that Macedonius, has shown his love for eternity, truth, and charity. Macedonius seems to understand this himself and even concedes to Augustine that these commandments of ours and the mysteries of the single and true God will indeed alleviate this present age and the unavoidable circumstances into which we are born. In other words, Macedonius has learned that following the beliefs of his faith are actually good for alleviating the situation of the people over whom he rules. As Fran pointed out earlier in his comments, my comments say as much about us as they do about President Biden. He and we have facilitated this culture that makes it intelligible and desirable the instrumentalization of our faith for political and much more mundane social purposes. In our own little lives, we compartmentalize the faith out of the same calculus that informs Biden's political calculations. Too many of us enjoy the sweetness of this life and fear offending persons who might injure or end our enjoyment of these sweet things. Our fear of losing these things, our love of a flattering tongue and human praise, prevents us from following Macedonius and embracing the difficult offices of love. I take Augustine's insights as germane to the conversation, not merely because of the depth of his reflections, but because President Biden clearly cares for St. Augustine. Biden could be ruled by his Catholic beliefs, much as I suspect any of us is actually ruled by our beliefs. He could embrace them in the confidence that by doing so, he would be more fully serving his neighbors and the faith he surely loves, and in no small way show something meaningful about the compatibility of Catholicism with our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. And no, I don't need to improve my pool of moral theologians. That was terrific, especially knowing as I do how all this intersects with many of your deep commitments. I really thought you brought them to bear in an acute and helpful, constructive way. I have a couple of questions of my own, but I don't want to come to them now. There's a question from a student, Hannah Schur, here, and I think it may have been asked during the earlier presentation, that is John McGreevy's, but it could be addressed to you as well. And it's this: is there room left these days for Christian Catholic laypersons to engage in the political process while adhering to the faith?
Yeah, look, Hannah's question is a great question. The answer is yes, right? I mean, the answer is, in my mind, is clearly yes. The room might be narrower, right, than perhaps it's been at different times. But my guess is, if we did the kind of historical study that John was, sort of inviting us into, looking at in his own comments, we'd see that these spaces open and close all the time. What I see from St. Augustine, right, drawing on St. Augustine, is that those opportunities are present for Christians. We typically have accepted a kind of a priori that, no, we can't do this. We can't do this as Christians. We can't do this as fully Christian. We've bought, in my judgment, by doing so, into a certain kind of understanding of what liberal politics requires of us, right? Liberal political systems require of believers, but we haven't even so fully bought it that we expect that of people of other faiths. It's often striking to me how people, on the one hand, accept this for Christianity, but on the other hand, they're quite drawn to the way that Jewish politicians or politicians of, even Muslim faith at this point are bringing their faith into the political sphere. If we see the good of that, we should certainly also sort of apply that to ourselves and recognize there are opportunities here. They may terminate certain kinds of national ambitions early on, but there we also have that opportunity to reflect on ourselves and our political ambitions and see which is more important to us: the ambition to govern politically, or the ambition to live with Christ in eternity. And that's also what Augustine is trying to argue with Macedonius about.
One of the questions I had, which I think I'll ask now. Now I see a new one has come in. So I'll put off mine until later. So historically, this is the question, Joe. Historically, Roman Catholics in the U.S. were objects of suspicion because they were seen to be Catholics who happened to be American or hoped to be Americans. Surely this is, in fact, a Catholic's basic truth. Catholic who happens to be American. The fundamental truth is an Orthodox faith in Jesus Christ, but the pressure is to assimilate, to conform. True humility and charity would contest this cultural pressure, would it not? Not in a triumphalistic way, but in a public and courageous way.
Yeah, look, I agree. Yes, I think true humility would incline us to resist this pressure to assimilate, or at the minimum, what it would do is it would question the rules of the assimilation, right? Certain understandings of this assimilation are obviously informed by historical forces, cultural forces, and of course, certain kinds of religious forces, including certain variants of Protestantism in the US. There's no reason, I think, to think that that the notion of assimilation is static, right? That it sort of involves certain elements to it. We, as people of faith, should always be questioning the rules of this assimilation and asking, where can we make compromises and where can't we? And that even in itself, right, is an element of a kind of recurring thought in our faith about the places where Christians could stand up in conscience against their communities, and those places where Christians were expected to be obedient to the demands of their communities. You see this in Augustine, you see this in lots of the early fathers, and of course in later theological thought, and again in the encyclical tradition itself, that there's a recognition that there are points where Christians out of their faith need to be good citizens, and there are points where out of their faith they need to be bad citizens. They need to question what citizenship is now requiring of them, or what assimilation is now requiring of them.
Ambassador Kamick had asked earlier, and it was for John McGreevy, but we didn't get a chance to reach it. But I think it would be useful for you, Joe, to take a try at it. Why is it the church's duty to defend democracy, especially when John Paul II emphasized democracy's failure when it is not oriented to the truth with a capital T, truth?
Well, so I don't think, right. So I guess in a way I agree with what seems like a premise of Ambassador Kamek's question, which is the church doesn't have a kind of in se obligation to defend, democracy. It has an obligation to defend the pursuit of true things, right, and the political regimes that allow individuals and social groups to pursue those things. So, in as much as democratic forms of governance allow us to pursue shared goods that are genuine goods, then the church recognizes the value of those democratic forms, and even more particularly, given certain modern developments, recognizes how democracy esteems the awareness of people as individuals who understand themselves as wanting to rightly, participate in their own governance. This is a theme that you see repeated in, the council teachings in Gaudium et Spes. It's present, and Pope John Paul II and Benedict and Francis have all picked up on this theme that people rightly understand the good of participating in their own governance, and democracy seems a form of political governance that's particularly apt to it. But they also warn that because of this, right, people can also use democracy as an instrument for bad ends, and you wouldn't want to defend it in those terms.
This is a good opportunity for one of the questions I had. So in my Justice and Rights class that I mentioned in my opening remarks, where we read last week a little bit of Book 19 of the City of God, before that we read Alistair McIntyre's Dependent Rational Animals. And I tried to situate that a little more broadly in McIntyre's critique of what it is we're doing, above all in the United States today, under the umbrella of liberal constitutional democracy. And I wonder how, Joe, you would respond for purposes of this conversation to McIntyre's by now standard, but recently more refined critique of our inability as the kinds of people we've become, as the kinds of citizens we've become, to reason effectively about the goods that you just mentioned, the church having a fundamental obligation to defend as the final causes of legitimate political order.
Yeah, so the question is about, Patrick, just so I understand it, the question is basically about like a decline in the quality of our reasoning about these goods, and perhaps even more particularly the decline of our communal reasoning about these goods. Is that largely what you're asking about? And
it's being necessary or endemic to the kind of social ordering that always or almost always attends liberal constitutional democracy at the level at which it's always been tried and is justified.
Well, so in a way, this would be a great question to follow up on in the panel, because I think it'd be interesting to hear from John on this from a historical perspective, or anybody else, from a more historical perspective. The challenge to reason well communally and about, to reason well about social ordering and so on, and to think in terms of hierarchical goods, for instance, I just see that as a recurring challenge for communities. And if you read Augustine enough, right, or if you read other moments in right, sort of our history, you'll see there's been bad reasoning for a long time, right? Or bad reasoning, comes and goes, and so I guess in a way I am not as pessimistic perhaps as maybe Fran was when he was talking that we're in some special moment of bad reasoning. There are times I feel pretty down about it, no question, and and am surprised by the level of reasoning that's employed by people I even agree with, right, on most things. But that challenge has never gone away, right? It's almost a feature even of the way we understand the operation of natural law, right? That we recognize that while we make certain kinds of robust claims about natural law and our capacity, right, to reason on its basis, right, and with, you know, on its even its almost its method, that same account also shows us that getting from certain kinds of claims to really, you know, particular details about social ordering and so on is really hard, right? And it's only magnified by the fact that now we expect to do this together, right, with a larger group of people rather than, you know, one or a small council and so on. So to some extent, there may just be some dispositional differences here, but you know, I draw hope from the fact that if you read history and criticisms, for instance, just of liberal political society and so on from the late 19th century, the early 20th century, the middle of the 20th century, you see people shaking their heads and saying, look, it's just, right, they're aghast at the level of reasoning. And I think we ought to take some counsel from that before judging ourselves too hard.
Thanks. That was a great response. And I'll take your invitation to continue this theme in the roundtable later. Well, this is a perfect breaking point for our 45-minute lunch break. I'd like to thank our three panelists for really outstanding presentations and the audience for very helpful questions. So we have 45 minutes and we'll resume promptly at 12:30. Thanks, everybody. So our next speaker is Stephen White, the Executive Director of the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America, and he's also a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. And I had read Stephen White's essays for a long time and always enjoyed them and had been hoping sometime that our paths would cross. But right about the time I started to plan this conference, I read an essay by Stephen White in The Catholic Thing, that said that President Biden's imminent inauguration and leadership over the coming 4 years would, for better or worse, influence Catholic life in the United States. And that way of putting it caught my attention, and the essay as a whole was useful in the ways his always had been for me. And so I immediately wrote to him in the hope that he would join us, confirming my sense that this was the right time to raise these issues. And I was delighted when he accepted the invitation. Without further ado, Stephen White. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you, Professor Brennan, and to Dean Alexander and everyone at the law school for putting this together and for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to start where several of the previous panelists have already touched on, with a passage from Joe Biden's memoir, Promises to Keep, in which he describes his own Catholicism. He wrote, "I'm as much a cultural Catholic as I am a theological Catholic. My idea of self, of family, of community, of the wider world comes straight from my religion. It's not so much the Bible, the Beatitudes, the Ten Commandments, the sacraments, or the prayers I learned. It's the culture." And taking off those comments, I want to start with the question, what is this culture, which is, in his own words, the hallmark of President Biden's Catholicism? Joe Biden was 19 years old when the Second Vatican Council opened in 1962. He was formed in a way of being Catholic typical of his generation. This way of being Catholic in the United States bridges, as I said, the pre- and post-conciliar eras, a largely ethnic, immigrant, largely urban Catholicism of Biden's youth, which was at the time politically, culturally, and socially ascendant. The culmination of this ascendancy being marked, at least politically, by the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960. Something like 80% of Catholics voted for Kennedy in that election. This way of being Catholic maintains certain accidents of the pre-conciliar church, certain vestigial pieties and a basic level of catechesis combined with a certain antinomianism and uncritical cultural accommodation typical of the post-conciliar church in the United States. Catholics of Biden's generation watched Archbishop Fulton Sheen on TV, winning Emmy Awards in the 1950s, but they also know a lot of the music of the St. Louis Jesuits. Biden is not technically a baby boomer. He's actually a few years earlier than that. But I want to call this way of being Catholic boomer Catholicism. And I don't mean that necessarily in a derogatory term, but to associate it with a particular generation. Boomer Catholicism is a way of being Catholic that borrows a great deal from the ambient culture. I would question, however, historically, how much it has given back to the culture. At least, what has it given back that's essentially and distinctively Catholic? Biden's election as president presents a significant challenge and perhaps an opportunity to the Church in the United States, not so much because Joe Biden is a radical exception among American Catholics, but precisely because his Catholicism is, in a certain way, unexceptional. There are millions of Joe Biden Catholics at Mass every Sunday, particularly Catholics of a certain age. As Fran Maier pointed out this morning, Biden's Catholicism is not unusual these days. In fact, Biden's positions on many policy issues, his way of being Catholic, is neither radical nor exceptional among American Catholics. His views are widely held by millions of Americans. Be that as it may, the truth is that being Catholic in the United States no longer indicates a distinctive approach to politics. Perhaps even more concerning from a Catholic point of view is that being Catholic in America no longer indicates a distinctive set of religious practices. Indeed, the mere fact that someone is Catholic or identifies as Catholic tells us next to nothing about the content of his or her religious beliefs. James Joyce's line, "Catholic means here comes everybody," is a good reminder that our religious tribe has always been a varied and motley one, filled with sinners and saints alike. Still, the state of Catholic belief in the United States, and thus the state of Catholic witness in public life, seems particularly degraded these days. This is one reason why Catholic so often comes with a modifier: liberal Catholic, conservative Catholic, John Paul II Catholic, Pope Francis Catholic, Catholic in the Jesuit tradition, etc. The modifiers are needed to convey any meaningful distinction at all. The necessity of such modifiers should give us all pause, especially when we uncritically apply them to ourselves. Recall to mind St. Paul's chastisement of the Corinthians for their worldly way of thinking. Whenever someone says, "I belong to Paul," and another, "I belong to Apollos," are you not merely human? It's an interesting question to ask how we arrived at this state of affairs. One could point to one or another ideologies of the left or the right that have slowly stripped away the distinctiveness of Catholic life in this country. If one supposes, as some do, that 4 years of rationalizing bad behavior by the previous president has corrupted the consciences of some Catholics, imagine what 4 decades of rationalizing support for legal abortion has done. One could point to the years after the Second Vatican Council, when sacramental discipline collapsed amid social and cultural upheaval. One could blame bishops who abdicated their responsibility to teach and govern, permitting their flocks to stray with impunity. And there's probably a grain of truth in each of these explanations. I think all of those explanations taken alone are inadequate, though. We should be willing to acknowledge that Catholics in the United States have lost our distinctiveness, not just because of something that happened to us, but because we, Catholics in the United States, chose to. The Catholic columnist for the New York Times, Elizabeth Bruenig, has written about the unintended consequences of generations of Catholics striving to find a home in a Protestant America that was for a long time suspicious of Catholics. In short, we lost our Catholic distinctiveness because we wanted to fit in. Bruenig writes, I quote, "Perhaps Catholics have earned the right to no distinction, the privilege of blending seamlessly into the social and political landscape of the United States, the freedom of having no special moral obligations. And what a wide, barren, featureless liberty it is," unquote. The effect on the Catholic faith of this accommodation has been corrosive. Call it enculturation, call it syncretism, call it, as Pope Francis has, the triumph of a technocratic paradigm, which has deluded us into believing that ordering human society is about the technocratic exercise of power, when it really is about the proper ends of human existence, both natural and supernatural. If being Catholic isn't a sign of contradiction to the worldly orthodoxies of our time, then surely we are doing something wrong. If we see the church as a compassionate NGO, to quote Pope Francis again, then we are proclaiming not Christ, but, in his words, a demonic worldliness. If our Catholic faith is indistinguishable from the spirit of the age, We are like salt that has lost its flavor. All of which is to say the Catholic culture, which was so formative for Joe Biden, does not exist in the United States anymore. If Joe Biden's election marks the apotheosis of boomer Catholicism, it's also the triumph of a way of being Catholic whose time has long passed. So that's my first point, simply that any consideration of the Biden effect ought to consider the unique and unrepeatable circumstances, political, cultural, social, etc., from which Biden's own cultural Catholicism arose. My second main point has to do with the way the church herself has responded to the changing circumstances which shaped Joe Biden and Catholics of his generation. I'll look particularly at the question of how the church has responded with respect to politics, though I would note that distinguishing political things from social things or cultural things is a bit tricky. Distinctions can be made. Separating these out entirely, though, is not really possible. The loss of Catholic distinctiveness in the United States, not just political distinctiveness, but moral, philosophical, and theological distinctiveness, has been a long time coming. The Joe Biden problem, if it's a problem, in this sense, has little to do with Joe Biden himself. If the days of Camelot and the Kennedys, the days when 80% of Catholics voted for the same presidential candidate, are long gone, then gone too are the days when pro-choice Catholics like Mario Cuomo, then governor of New York, defended his willingness to tolerate a right to abortion on the grounds that his personal opposition to abortion as a Catholic gave him no right to impose that opposition on others. The Cuomo Compromise, laid out at the University of Notre Dame in 1984, has slowly, irresistibly, and predictably, perhaps, devolved into the position now exemplified by Biden. The Catholic faith teaches us to seek justice. Abortion rights are a matter of justice, framed by the Biden campaign as access to health care. Therefore, we should defend the abortion license where it is threatened and expand it where it is lacking. We've gone from essentially a negative take on how to approach this, I won't impose something, to a positive, I will actively promote and support something. What is the church, and particularly the bishops, to make of a Catholic in public office who, like Joe Biden, would tout the way in which his Catholic faith shapes his politics and then ask his fellow citizens to vote for him, precisely on the promise that he will devote himself to defending and promoting the single greatest injustice in American life since chattel slavery, namely legal abortion? Is there anything the bishops individually or collectively can do about it? Much of the discussion of what to do with a prominent Catholic politician who actively and openly opposes fundamental teachings of the church has focused on the question of whether or not they should be admitted to communion. I would like to address this a little bit, but not in the usual way. Nowhere is the individualist strain in American Catholicism, a strain of individualism, I would argue, sort of imbibed from the culture around us. Nowhere is this individualist strain more manifest than in the ubiquitous belief that the reception of the Holy Eucharist is a private matter between the communicant and God. The reception of Holy Communion is, to be sure, a deeply personal matter, but it is much more than that. It's an interpersonal act, and fundamentally, it is an ecclesial act, never a private one. Underlying all of the ongoing debates about Catholic politicians and communion is this reality. The reception of communion is an ecclesial act. It explains why the arguments long predate the election of Joe Biden and will almost certainly continue after he has left office. Understanding the reception of communion and sacramental discipline as being more than just a question of private conscience underscores why it's hard to treat ecclesial acts through the lens of private action, and why doing so has implications far beyond sacramental discipline. Which brings me to my next point. The church speaks often and consistently about the idea of social or structural sin. The notion of collective responsibility, of social sin, to use a phrase that's often maligned, at least on the right. This notion ought not to be foreign to anyone familiar with Scripture. God judges us as individuals, yes, but also as members of peoples, assigning guilt and judging grievance both personally and corporately. Many of the social justice issues which President Biden himself emphasizes, and which, as Biden is quick to point out, Pope Francis also emphasizes, are difficult to assess morally without some understanding of this collective responsibility for the common good, including a collective sense of responsibility for structural and social sin. Look at the headlines in any newspaper or on any website recently, and we'll see how this plays out. However, here in the United States, the church's teaching on social sin is often, wrongly, I would insist, disregarded as a leftist political racket. Why is that? Why is it that so many American Catholics are dismissive of social sin? One reason, I think, is that for decades, Catholic politicians have defended and expanded the abortion license and abortion subsidies, both at home and abroad, with virtual impunity. Meanwhile, the average layman or laywoman in the pew is expected to feel personally responsible for a whole host of structural issues, from climate change to racism to the resettlement of refugees, that are far beyond their direct immediate control. The distinct impression of this is that there is one set of expectations and standards for everyday Catholics and another for well-connected, influential Catholics. That is to say that our faith ought to have consequences for our politics, but our politics have no consequences for our faith. Our politics have no ecclesial consequences. If the bishops are serious about the urgency of addressing social sin, and I think they are, and they ought to be, then why the manifest willingness to tolerate, without any ecclesial consequences whatsoever, direct, unambiguous support for the expansion of a systemic injustice, abortion, that costs millions and millions of lives? If the bishops can't rouse themselves to act as if direct support for such a grave evil has ecclesial consequences, not just personal or private consequences, but ecclesial and social consequences, why would anyone take seriously the bishop's purported urgency on matters over which individual Catholics have far, far less influence? The pastoral challenge here goes far beyond communion and abortion. It extends to the very credibility of the church's public witness. Nothing is more antithetical to a consistent ethic of life, and that's something that I think is worth defending, the idea that we should be consistent on life issues. Nothing rends that seamless garment more than support for the industrial scale eradication of innocent lives through abortion. This is precisely why the bishops have stated that abortion is their preeminent political concern, and it's precisely why the bishops initially convened an ad hoc committee dedicated to coordinating the response to the challenges posed by a pro-choice Catholic president. For decades, the implicit measure of Catholicism has been engagement in public life. This is true both for those who measure Catholicity by fidelity to the Church's teachings on the sanctity of life and marriage, as it is for those who measure Catholicity by commitment to various social assistance programs. The bishops, for their part, have not succeeded in challenging the premise that political engagement, underlying both of these partial measures of fidelity, is actually the measure of Catholicity, of fidelity to the Catholic faith. President Biden will continue to push the limits of what is seen as acceptable action for Catholics in public life. His example will reshape how the public and Catholics themselves understand what it means to be Catholic. He may not redefine American Catholicism in doctrinal or canonical sense, a point that is not to be underestimated. But as a practical matter, it's hard to see how his example will not have precisely this effect. Archbishop Fulton Sheen famously said, "If we do not live life as we believe, we will come to believe according to how we live." The culture that formed Joe Biden is long gone. The culture that forms today's Catholics is very different, and if nothing else, far less Catholic. The theological and ecclesial complexities aside, the de facto cultural leaders of the Church in the United States are not the United States bishops. Joe Biden is not responsible for this state of affairs, but his election as president may push this problem closer to a resolution, or at least to a new status quo. Pope Benedict XVI famously spoke of the possible future. He was speaking about Europe, but he spoke about the possible future of a smaller, purer church. This was not a prescription or something to be strived for, but a description of a possible reality in which Catholics Catholics fell away from the church because their Catholicism offered nothing distinctive from the culture around them. This idea of a smaller, the idea of a smaller, purer church is often contrasted to a line of Pope Francis from early in his papacy, when he spoke about his desire for a church that is poor and for the poor. I would suggest in conclusion here that these are not competing realities, that a church that discovers a way to be distinctively Catholic in the United States may in fact end up being smaller, it may in fact end up being poor and for the poor. But in so doing, it may heal the gap that exists between what is seen as theological orthodoxy and social justice. Reestablishing a connection between these two realities of Catholic life may be the future of the Catholic Church in the United States. One can only hope. As I said, a smaller, purer church and a church that is poor and for the poor may not be competing realities, but may in fact be descriptions of the same future for the church here in the United States. Whether the new way of doing things that we will experience in the coming decades will redound to the good of the church and the nation remains to be seen. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you. That was just outstanding. I'm going to take a moment to see if some questions. Sorry, I have to. I'm not seeing yet any questions for you. The ones here are from earlier for Joe Capizzi. But while we're giving people an opportunity, you're probably familiar with Pope Benedict's or then Cardinal Ratzinger's observation. I think it was in a radio interview, I'm not sure, in 1968, in which he said that the Church of the future, as he said again later, would be much smaller. But he said is specifically in that 1968 piece that the Church of the future would mostly be people who were specially touched. And I don't know what the German was for that, but in English, I've seen discussions that assumed a common meaning, and I think I know what he meant. But I just wondered if in any of your research and thinking, you've seen points along those lines that in the patterns you described, the patterns you describe will ultimately give way to something even more radical, which is not quite captured by the convergence of those two models of Pope Benedict and Francis that you talked about in the end. But instead, that special encounter that I know Benedict associates with the primitive church in certain ways. I could say more, but maybe you sort of get what I'm driving at.
Yeah, there's a we've heard a lot in the last several decades about a new evangelization, and I think there has been a tendency to take that as I don't like talking about it in terms of triumphalism, but that the church is going to start winning. Maybe that's an even more offensive way of putting it, right? That somehow the church is going to take its imperfect place in society and in culture and ascend all the more. But I think it's helpful to think of evangelization, the new evangelization, not as a repeat of, say, the evangelization of the New World, but as more along the model of the first evangelization, where you had a small 11, 12 group of disciples and apostles who proclaimed the gospel in its sort of in the full joy. Pope Francis talks about this all the time. A church that spread not because it had a culture existing through which to transmit faith, but by personal encounter, by personal evangelization, by distinctive living, by the joy of the gospel, by the joy of understanding what it means to have experienced God's mercy. A mercy that doesn't, by the way, necessarily liberate us from suffering in this life and doesn't liberate us from ultimately dying, but it liberates us from sin and from damnation. That the good that we do, the social justice works that we do, to use our contemporary idiom, are important in themselves, but are perhaps primarily important because they are a foretaste and a point to an even greater kind of salvation and even greater kind of mercy. Taking that as a model is a bit intimidating. It's scary for a church that, like the church in the United States, has a lot of has built up a lot of collateral, put a lot of time and energy into building institutions and models of engagement and a way of being Catholic in this particular country that might have to go. That's a very scary thing. If you think of all of the great things that Catholics in this country have built, especially in the early 20th century, and we were talking about institutions before, schools, universities, hospitals, the list goes on and on. Those are good works, and I don't mean to suggest that we should stop doing those things. But if political realities force Catholics to choose between those good things and fidelity to the gospel, what are they going to choose? When fidelity to the gospel means that you lose a lot of good things, that's a scary kind of discipleship. And I think more and more that's the choice that Catholics in this country, and probably not only in this country, have to face. Do you want to be welcome in polite company, as Joe Capizzi said earlier, in polite society, or are you content to be faithful? We don't have to force that choice. It's not a choice that should be taken lightly. But I think if that's the choice that we face, then it's one that the church is going to have to make some hard decisions. I spent some time in England years ago, and one of the things I noticed about the Catholic Church in the UK is anybody who wasn't there for a very good reason had left a long time ago. There weren't people who were just sort of around because that's what you do. Everyone there had a real reason to be there, often with an intense personal conversion story or something like that. Now, the eccentricity quotient was quite high, but it was a small band of happy disciples. And if that's the future, it comes with some disadvantages, but it also has advantages. A small flame can burn all the brighter sometimes.
Thank you. That really spoke to what I was thinking about. Unless I'm missing them, I don't see any more questions. Okay, here we go. Here's from an anonymous attendee. How do we help fellow Catholics who approve of Biden because of his social justice stance to see the problem with Biden's position on abortion?
I'm tempted to say, well, if you find out, let me know. My answer to that, I think, is one to reaffirm the importance of working for social justice. There's a weird bifurcation that many people have commented on, but still sort of mystifies me, of between social justice, a faith that does good works, and what often gets labeled Orthodox Catholicism. But there's no way that these two things can be sustained independent of each other. That a faithful Catholic loves the poor, and if he doesn't, he's going to have a rude awakening when he gets before the ultimate judge. That said, we can't love our neighbor if we're not doing it in accordance with the truth. So my answer is that affirm the good of good social justice activities, but also to insist that the defense of abortion undermines the credibility of the witness in other areas. To say we will help people, but we will at the same time exclude certain people from, private implementation of lethal violence. There's a contradiction there, and pointing out that contradiction can be a way of working towards that. It's a very difficult problem given the political and social and cultural history, but I think something that has to be done.
Thank you, Stephen. All right. There's one more question, again, from Sean Skedulewski, but in the interest of staying on time, but also of maybe returning to Sean's question in the roundtable, because I think it could be usefully addressed by at least a number of the panelists. I'd like to introduce our final speaker of the day, and he's Father Gerald Murray. He's pastor of the Church of the Holy Family in New York City. He's a trained canon lawyer, a practicing canon lawyer. And I have followed Father Murray's work also with Prophet for a long time. And when I decided to organize this conversation, as I said earlier, I was sure that I needed to have pastoral perspectives, and Father Luke was one of those voices. But Father Murray's, as I'd heard it on television and elsewhere for a long time, speaking as a pastor of souls, but especially, though not exclusively, through the instrument of the church's legal system, I knew that he would be a person who could speak with special intelligence and charity to these issues on all of relevant levels. And so I'm especially delighted to welcome him and give him an opportunity to address, I know, some of the issues that have come up over and over today, but need an expert answer. Father Murray.
Thank you, Professor Brennan. It's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this panel and to participate in this important discussion. So I will look at it, as you indicated, from a canonical point of view, and to answer this question that comes up, the interface between religious practice, church law, personal responsibility, and then public scandal, because all of these things come together in the matter of our new president and his public reception of Holy Communion. I'll look at it starting with a couple of documents from the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith, which deal with political life. And I'd like to expand it beyond abortion to the question of so-called same-sex marriage, because as we know, President Biden did endorse same-sex marriage during his time as vice president, even before President Obama endorsed it. And previous to that endorsement, they had both been against it. So we had a flip there. And likewise, on abortion, it's been demonstrated that President Biden, a former opponent of legalized abortion beginning of his political career, has now endorsed it, including public financing and then the use of government money to pay for abortions overseas and in the military. So as regards the doctrine of the faith, the congregation issued a note in 2002. Cardinal Ratzinger was in charge at the time, concerning the participation of Catholics in political life. And in that, in the fourth paragraph, we find the following. John Paul II, continuing the constant teaching of the Church, has reiterated many times that those who are directly involved in lawmaking bodies have a grave and clear obligation to oppose any law that attacks human life. For them, as for every Catholic, it is impossible to promote such laws or to vote for them. In this context, it must also be noted that a well-formed Christian conscience does not permit one to vote for a political program or an individual law which contradicts the fundamental contents of faith and morals. And then I'll read one more quote from this document. When political activity comes up against moral principles that do not admit of exception, compromise, or derogation, the Catholic commitment becomes more evident and laden with responsibility. In the face of fundamental and inalienable ethical demands, Christians must recognize that what is at stake is the essence of the moral law, which concerns the integral good of the human person. This is the case with laws concerning abortion and euthanasia, not to be confused with the decision to forego ordinary treatments, which is morally legitimate. Such laws must defend the basic right to life from conception to natural death. In the same way, it is necessary to recall the duty to respect and protect the rights of the human embryo. I'll pause to note that the Biden administration has just authorized the government purchase of body parts taken from aborted fetuses. Analogously, the family needs to be safeguarded and promoted based on monogamous marriage between a man and a woman. protected in its unity and stability in the face of modern laws on divorce. In no way can other forms of cohabitation be placed on the same level as marriage, nor can they receive legal recognition as such. So the question of voting, and it's clear that when we talk about voting, we would also include a president who is advocating for and promising to implement laws that the legislature would enact. There are definite obligations on the part of a Catholic. Now, the Congregation of Doctrine and Faith in 2003, the following year, issued a document called Considerations Regarding Proposals to Give Legal Recognitions to Unions Between Homosexual Persons. And this is an area that is very contentious in our own culture and in our law since Obergefell and the promised developments of that in our current administration. So in the 10th paragraph, it's written by, again, Cardinal Ratzinger, if it is true that all Catholics are obliged to oppose the legal recognition of homosexual unions, Catholic politicians are obliged to do so in a particular way, in keeping with their responsibility as politicians. So that's not a question if, it's an emphasizer. The politician has an even greater obligation than the rest of Catholics to oppose the legal recognition of homosexual unions. The document says, when legislation in favor of the recognition of homosexual unions is proposed for the first time in a legislative assembly, the Catholic lawmaker has a moral duty to express his opposition clearly and publicly and to vote against it. To vote in favor of a law so harmful to the common good is gravely immoral. So we'll pause there. It didn't happen in the US in general by legislation. It happened mostly through court cases. I think there was only one state that voted to legalize so-called same-sex marriages. And then that was extended to all 50 states by the Supreme Court. But the Catholic Church teaches it is a gravely immoral thing to enact such laws and to support them. The document then says, when legislation in favor of the recognition of homosexual unions is already in force, the Catholic politician must oppose it in ways that are possible for him and make his opposition known. It is his duty to witness to the truth. And that, I think, comes down to one of the central contradictions of the current Biden presidency. He has a duty to witness to the truth as a Catholic. And in this case, the truth that he's witnessing to is not a particularity of Catholicism that would be unacceptable to propose for the general population. It is, in fact, a precept of the moral law that undergirds Western civilization, its morality and law, and its understanding of the role in the state to protect individual rights. And there is no right to something that is wrong, and there is no duty on the part of a Catholic to withdraw from consideration when laws proposing unjust institutions are enacted. And that's what we're dealing with here with both abortion and so-called same-sex marriage. Now, where does that leave us? Well, should President Biden be receiving Holy Communion? And now we go to canon law. And there are three canons which have pertinence here. Canon 912 says, any baptized person not prohibited by law can and must be admitted to Holy Communion. So Catholics have a right, baptized persons, because canonical discipline also admits Orthodox Christians to receive communion at a Catholic Mass. And in certain circumstances, Protestant Catholics, Christians can also receive communion at a Catholic Mass. So baptized people should be admitted unless they're prohibited by law. And what is the appropriate law here? Well, the law is, they refer specifically to canon law, but the canon law is a development of the moral law, the moral teaching of the Church, and is a way to regulate behavior in the public sphere. And as was previously said by one of our speakers, the reception of Holy Communion is not a private matter. It is, in fact, a public act by its nature, and therefore it has social effects. So Canon 9:15 says, those who have been excommunicated or interdicted after the imposition or declaration of the penalty, and others obstinately persevering in manifest grave sin, are not to be admitted to Holy Communion. So this canon deals with the behavior of those distributing the sacrament of Holy Communion. It is not related to the personal desire or obligation on the part of the person in question. They are not to be admitted to Holy Communion, the canon says. Now, the president has not been excommunicated or interdicted. No penalties have been declared, but it is manifest that he obstinately perseveres in manifest grave sin. And what is that grave sin? It's his failure to fulfill the Christian obligation to come to the defense of his neighbor in the case of unborn children, according to his abilities and powers, and also to uphold the moral law regarding the institution of marriage in society. It is a grave matter to reject church teaching in this question, precisely because it concerns state-sanctioned killing of citizens, killing of people. Now, that's the famous distinction in Roe v. Wade and his accompanying case, that the fetus doesn't have any legal personality. Leaving that aside, it certainly is a human being. So now the third canon I'll quote, and then we'll go back to this question about how we interpret the president's support for abortion as being a manifest grave sin and its canonical consequences. Canon 9:16 says, a person who is conscious of grave sin is not to celebrate Mass or receive the body of the Lord without previous sacramental confession. Unless there's a grave reason, there's no opportunity to confess. In this case, the person is to remember the obligation to make an act of perfect contrition, which includes the resolution of confessing as soon as possible. So this canon deals with the attitude and the behavior of the person himself, and how his request to receive Holy Communion should be taken only in consideration of this canon. If President Biden or any other Catholic politician who supports legalized abortion doesn't believe that he's committing a grave sin, then he is not conscious of grave sin. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not sinful to support abortion. It simply means that he doesn't consider himself to have committed a sin in supporting abortion. This is definitely a deficient understanding of his obligation as a Christian, and therefore is something that is subject to public correction, because his acts will have social effects beyond simply his legal powers as President of the United States to promote abortion. His acts as a self-identified Catholic who regularly invokes that status to seek popular support for his positions can lead to the thought that he indeed continues to be recognized by others as a good Catholic in good standing. And that might give the impression, or will give the impression, that it's perfectly okay to support legalized abortion. That is where the problem comes up, because President Biden has not, like other Catholics who support abortion, turned away from going to Mass and receiving communion, or at least receiving communion if they are going to Mass. Many of them do have that notion that since they know the church is against it, they shouldn't go to communion, but he doesn't have that understanding. So how does the Catholic Church deal with that? Well, Canon 9:15 is meant to promote a just public order in the church and the salvation of souls, both of the party involved and of those in general observing his behavior. And this is where we get to a famous letter that Cardinal Ratzinger sent also in the year 2004. So this is 1 year after that document that we quoted earlier, basically dealing with the question of principles for worthiness to receive Holy Communion. Now, this document is available because it was leaked to the press. It is not published on the website of the Holy See. This was a letter intended for the Bishops' Conference, yet that letter was never made available to them because Cardinal Mccarrick, who we heard about earlier, decided to summarize it and misrepresent it to the Bishops' Conference. And then he was publicly embarrassed when the contents of the letter came out. So I'll just read a couple of paragraphs from that because it sums up well how the Catholic Church can, in complete charity and fidelity to the truth, deny Holy Communion to someone like our president who proposes abortion. Paragraph 4 in this letter to the American hierarchy. Apart from an individual's judgment about his worthiness to present himself to receive the Holy Eucharist, the minister of Holy Communion may find himself in a situation where he must refuse to distribute Holy Communion to someone, such as in cases of declared excommunication or obstinate persistence in manifest grave sin. Now, regarding the sins of abortion and euthanasia, when a person's formal cooperation becomes manifest, understood in the case of a Catholic politician as is consistently campaigning and voting for permissive abortion and euthanasia laws, his pastor should meet with him, instructing him about the Church's teaching, informing him that he is not to present himself for Holy Communion until he brings him to an end the objective situation of sin, and warning him that he will otherwise be denied the Eucharist. And then one more paragraph, number 6 of this letter. When these precautionary measures have not had their effect, or in which they were not possible, and the person in question with obstinate persistence still presents himself to receive the Holy Eucharist, the minister of Holy Communion must refuse to distribute it. This decision, properly speaking, is not a sanction or a penalty, nor is the minister of Holy Communion passing judgment on the person's subjective guilt, acting to the person's public unworthiness to receive Holy Communion due to an objective situation of sin. And that really is a very good summary and explanation of why politicians, Catholic politicians who vote for and support legalized abortion and other gravely immoral laws should not be receiving Holy Communion. It's an objective situation of sin. Their life is not lived in coherence with the faith they profess. And that really is a question that the president needs to be asked and needs to answer. How is it that you, who proclaim yourself to be a faithful follower of the Catholic Church, decide that teachings regarding a matter of grave importance can be set aside and have and not cause you to lose any public stance of public worthiness to receive Holy Communion? In other words, you know that the Church is against abortion. You know the Catholic politicians have a duty and obligation to fight for the right to life of unborn children. And yet, with that knowledge, you consider it your choice to be more important. And it comes down to who's in charge. And he says he's in charge. He decides what Catholicism means for him and his public activities, and it means for him he can receive communion. That's where the Church has to come back and say, no, the Church is in charge of the administration of the sacraments and the spiritual welfare of the faithful. And it is not beneficial to the spiritual welfare of the president or anyone else that if someone who proposes abortion laws, supports them, enforces them, helps pay for them, makes them expand to new places, that person should be receiving Holy Communion. Now, the last comment I'll make, because I see we're coming down to 2 minutes to go in my remarks, the question, since we're not judging the subjective guilt of the person, doesn't that give him the benefit of the doubt to say, well, subjectively, I think I'm okay, and I'm sorry that some people don't understand why I think it's okay, but let me keep going to communion. Well, pastorally speaking, if someone violates one of the 10 commandments and tries to justify it, you can basically tell them, objectively, you're wrong. And subjectively, since you know and want to be a Catholic, you have to say that this is in fact sinful behavior that you are almost certainly responsible for. So the law judges external acts. The law does not judge thoughts. The law certainly doesn't judge the status of a soul. But the law is there to give warnings to people on how to form their thoughts and how to cultivate the life of their soul and how to protect themselves from the penalty of damnation at the judgment when they die. Therefore, if you are supporting abortion, the chances are, given the state of the question, that you are knowledgeably making a responsible choice that defies the religion that you practice. I'm going to stop there because I had, as usual, prepared too much material, and canon lawyers like to expatiate on what other canon lawyers have written. There are other documents here I could go into. We'll have time for questions. I'll just say on the more general view, this question is not going to go away. The Archbishop of Washington has said that he will give communion to Biden. The Bishop of Wilmington, where he has his residence before moving to the White House, has also said he will give him communion. On the other hand, the Bishop of Denver just issued a document stating what I said, that he's not in a position where he should be receiving and being given communion. Archbishop Kurtz, head of the pro-life committee of the United States Bishops' Conference, said the same thing. The bishops need to get their act together, and I say that with all due respect. The Catholic people are scandalized that you could basically fight abortion ever since Roe v. Wade was enacted, and yet say a Catholic who supports Roe v. Wade is just as worthy as one who doesn't to receive communion. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Father. You addressed all the main points that I hope you would, with the sophistication and technical facility and charity that I expected. If I may, I'd like to ask the first question, and I do it a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's a very serious point. In my introductory remarks, I tried to set the context of one of our lived familiarity with the Church's very damaging failure to follow her own laws with respect to, broadly speaking, the Mccarrick case. And the tongue-in-cheek part is, how do you, as a very skilled, passionate pastoral canon lawyer, reconcile the fact that the Church, as Cardinal Burke has written so forcefully and intelligently claimed, that there are laws and procedures and mechanisms that have been in place for these cases for years that have been generally disregarded, followed in the breach, but disregarded also for deep, though I take it you'll conclude, mistaken theological and ecclesiological reasons?
Well, a very important question. When I went to study canon law in Rome back in the 90s, my background is both my mother and father are lawyers. I grew up trying to win arguments at the dinner table with two lawyers. That certainly sharpened the mind. But when I got to Rome, I began a study of canon law, fascinating. But then you basically see it is a system of voluntary cooperation on the part of the people in charge of enforcing it. Because there is no mechanism apart from the diocesan bishop and then the Holy See at the universal level for enforcing the law. If the bishop chooses not to enforce the law, there's no impeachment, there's no district attorney or court or judge who can issue injunctions and the like. No, there are no independent remedies apart from the Holy See regarding diocesan bishops to compel them to enforce the law. And the Mccarrick point you made, I was very happy you brought that up, because it is precisely the case that canon law did have the ability to sanction him, and it failed. And we know that Pope Benedict did implement provisions which were far short of a canonical penalty to try to restrict his behavior. But as Cardinal Burke said when all that was revealed, there should have been a canonical process and a decree issued based on the evidence gathered, because the crimes of Mccarrick were not simply private peccadillos. They had public effect, and they had harmed not only specific individuals, but the entire legal order and the populace in general. So canon law will be enforced when bishops decide that it's not a series of suggestions, but rather means for the charitable governance of the church. Because if love means willing the good of the other, well, one way you will the good of the other is to enforce justice.
Question from Nick Dowdle. Are there different modes of interpretation for canon law, or can we feel confident that the sections of canon law you mentioned are generally understood in the way you explained? Nick, thanks for a great question. Father Murray.
Yes, you know, the American legal system is distinct because you have case law, which can override legislation, and then you have constitutional interpretation, can override case law and legislation. So in canon law, it's basically law that is decreed by the supreme lawgiver, and then he himself has a commission to interpret it, which is called the Code Commission in common language. So when questions come up at the meaning of law, specific canons, they're answered that way. So when decrees are issued, it's clear that that's the intent that the lawgiver means it to have. And then one pope can overrule an earlier pope and suspend the canons and add new ones. Now, the Code of Canon Law is not the only source of law. So what I read now are two documents from the Doctrine of the Congregation's Doctrine of the Faith. Those have legal force in the life of the church, even though they're not issued by the Code Commission for interpretation of the code. Both of those documents that I quoted were approved by Pope John Paul II, so they had the specific approval of the Pope, so therefore they reflected his thinking. Now, yeah, so what I read there rather is the way the law is meant to be interpreted, and it is an accurate reflection of those three canons in implementing them. Now the question is, will those at the lower levels who have to obey the law accept that? And that's not always the case, and that's where we have the conflict.
Thank you, Father. I think we have time for one more question, and I'll take it from a familiar name from a long time ago, Roman Gallus, and the question is as follows. So, would fulfillment of his Catholic duty entail simply voicing opposition on grounds of religious doctrine to same-sex marriage? Or does it require more of him, namely, actively working to reverse, overturn same-sex marriage? Would you like me to read that again?
I understood that. For a Catholic, it would involve the second, because we believe that the equation of homosexual unions with marriage is immoral and unjust, and is a legal institution which has destructive effects upon societal life. It's a serious problem. Now, those people in the pews pray and advocate and write and vote, but those who occupy positions of authority in the government, they have, a role to play that is even more significant. So, just as we hear so often, and it's been mentioned in this conference, how unjust immigration laws, environmental laws, et cetera, need to be updated, changed, and reinforced, and not simply as an attempt to have a more economically viable society, but rather to have a more moral society which defends human nature and social good. Those arguments are legitimate to make according to those criteria, but the same criteria apply when it comes to abortion and same-sex marriage. These are not Catholic issues that have no importance or reference to anybody else.